Chapter 2012. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:55 and 20 seconds AM. Chapter 2012. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2012. Blueprints. The commotion this caused was hard to describe. It felt as though Lionel Palm had suddenly descended from the skies, casting a shadow over all and gripping each one of their hearts one by one. Life-grade crafters were simply impossibly rare. In the whole of the human domain, the number of them weren't even close to 4 digits. In fact, they weren't even halfway there. The difficulty of crossing that final step was one that had stalled many for far too long. To put this matter into perspective, there were easily millions upon millions of gold-grade crafters, and yet not even 500 life-grade crafters. This was how solid this bottleneck was. There were some exceptionally rare geniuses who could cross this step while in the 7th dimension. But it was more accurate to say that this was just a painting of how difficult it was to step into the 8th dimension rather than a function of how difficult it was to become a life-grade crafter. It was simply impossible for a person to focus on both unless you were on the level of Cynthia and Velasco, or had many years of experience like the Omen and Morales ancestors. And yet, here was an absolute genius with the strength of a 7th-dimensional existence at the 6th dimension who had already crossed this threshold. In fact, it seemed that he had crossed it long ago, so much so that he could create 1,000,000 of them right before their eyes. Cynthia gripped the railing of the Omen family flagship. Her pupils couldn't seem to stop trembling, even when she tried to stabilize herself. She had realized something from the beginning that everyone else was only now realizing. The stingrays. Lionel had no way of knowing they would be the oceanic beast he would receive. He hadn't even known what reward his subordinates would be able to bring back ahead of time. That meant that Lionel had casually drawn up a blueprint for a life-grade treasure in a few minutes before executing it right before all of their eyes. Blueprinting was a process that should have taken years alone. Cynthia had spent an entire decade on the blueprint she was most proud of. She hadn't even gotten around to crafting it yet. The essence of the life grade made the blueprint more important than almost the entire rest of the process. To be in the life grade only meant that you had created at least one blueprint of that level and had succeeded in crafting it. Many of the not even 500 life grade crafters in existence in the human domain only had 1 or 2 life grade blueprints to their name, and they were greatly praised for it. These 1 or 2 blueprints would be entirely unique to these crafters, and often powerful families and experts would be exorbitant prices just to have one of these unique treasures under their possession. There was a very good reason why the White Lion bow was such a big deal despite only having been at the quasi-life grade for most of its life until recently. Life-grade treasures were impossible rare. So impossibly rare that it was difficult to put into words. The best of the life-grade crafters had 1 or 2 dozen blueprints under their wings, including Cynthia. Only ancestor Hito of the Morales and the oldest Omen were speculated to have hundreds, maybe even thousands of such blueprints. However, there was a vast difference between having thousands of such blueprints and casually creating one after a few minutes of thought. Of course, there was also a difference between creating life-grade crafts using 6th-dimensional materials and 8th-dimensional materials like the one Cynthia and the other crafters of her level used. But Cynthia wasn't a fool. The gate of the life grade had little to do with dimension. That was something only laymen believed. Fundamentally, a life-grade crafter, regardless of the base materials used, was still the life grade. It was several orders of magnitude more valuable than the basic materials used. The more Cynthia thought about it, the harder she squeezed. This was the first time she had been so agitated. Even Lionel's combat strength hadn't done this. Not his Scarlet Star Force, not his Void Star Force, not his Vital Star Force, not even his powerful Dream Force. The weight of a life-grade crafter who could do such things was too much. But what Cynthia didn't know was that the weight was about to become much heavier than she could have ever expected. Lionel's eyes snapped open, breathing heavily 3 times before his beating heart calmed. He had really pushed it this time, but the life grade was a very finicky realm to enter. If he had taken a break in the middle, minute changes could have occurred that would have caused him to have to recalculate all over again. That would only make his situation even worse and extend the time he needed to take. Lionel pushed his way out and stepped out of the pod. Judging by the skies above, He had managed to recover in just 45 minutes. This was good. There was no time to waste. With a wave of his hand, the skies were suddenly filled with armors, shimmering like sapphires and emeralds. The ground shook and Lionel took a leap to the city walls. The armor shot down under his control, slipping onto the bodies of the stingrays below. The sound of clicking resounded before the blue waters suddenly began to glow. Suddenly, the stingrays seemed to naturally be formed into groups, a radiant aura coming from them. Lionel checked a new spatial ring that had appeared on his hand and nodded to himself. In the 3 days he had been focused on crafting, the others had already succeeded in finding what he needed. Without hesitation, Lionel executed several actions in a row, upgrading his cities to the gold grade one after another, and then fusing them. The sea began to churn wildly. In another insane feat, Lionel had activated the air grade upgrade challenge, without even waiting for the others to return. Chapter 2013. Published at 20th of July, 2023, 5:45 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 2013. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2013. Monster. With a flip of his palm, Lionel's black rod appeared. His hair whipped in the salty winds as the high sun pierced downward, illuminating everything. The waters turned frothy and agitated, but the cool air of the ice island he now stood upon left him feeling calm and unhurried. A confident aura exuded from Lionel, his momentum steadily growing with each passing second. In the distance, the waters began to rise. 300 large whale beasts appeared, surrounding the ice island entirely. Around them, millions of oceanic beasts began to appear. The numbers were so numerous that the waters turned black, a sharp contrast from the previous clarity. However, Lionel remained calm. The spectators could only remain silent. Were the life grade armors really enough? No one underestimated the worth of the life grade, but the problem was that they were so rare that many didn't even have a reference for how powerful they should be. Most would kill to get their hands on even a top-tier gold grade weapon, and this was all the reference they had. But was it enough to close a gap of 1 to 300? It was hard to believe, especially when the air grade generals began to appear. They looked to be even about 10% stronger than air grade threats that Lionel had fought previously. Each one was menacing to an extreme, and seemed to have the strength to lay waste to Lionel's city. But at that moment Lionel, who had everyone's focus, suddenly sneered. He raised his free hand and snapped his fingers. Right then, the world turned entirely silent. On the front line, a group of 10 stingrays suddenly trembled. They felt their backs grow hot as a powerful force art suddenly activated, but the chilly waters immediately cooled them down. A slight sheen of bluish-green formed on their bodies until they suddenly explosively expanded, forming a gorgeous, shimmering bubble. Then these 10 bubbles, one to each stingray, came into contact with one another and overlapped, fusing into one and forming a large bubble that enveloped all 10 of them. Just when it seemed like it was all finished, the large bubble morphed, flattening out and gaining sharper edges and a long protrusion, until it formed the construct of an enormous illusory stingray that contained 10 stingrays within. Even the smallest stingray was about 20 meters from wingtip to wingtip. But now, with this construct enveloping 10 of them, they seemed to have become larger than life, dwarfing 250 meters as they slowly swung their tails. In that instant, this process repeated, all at the same time, across the stingrays. At that moment, an army of what was once a million large stingrays had become an army of 100,000 enormous monstrosities, each causing vicious hurricane-like cyclones with just their small, insignificant movements. Lionel looked down as the challenge approached. He could almost feel the skepticism radiating from the observers. He had just limited the flexibility of the army he did have by a factor of 10, and the change didn't seem to be significant enough to cause any changes. What was the point of this? But Lionel's sneer only deepened. He didn't seem to have any intention of attacking himself. Kill. His words descended and the world suddenly changed. On the front line, the first line of stingray constructs suddenly jolted. The movement could only be described as a bolt of emerald green lightning. They left afterimages in the water, splitting it apart with such speed that a huge dividing line in the shape of an inverted V appeared on the surface. Fast. This was the only thought that those watching could have. so fast that it was crippling, so fast that it left only time for despair. The stingrays didn't even seem prepared for the level of speed they had now, so much so that they could do nothing but ram into the line of beasts they were facing. It was the kind of tactic that should have assured death. 100,000 running into a dense pack of over 300 million. How could it even compare? And yet silence reigned. The stingray constructs shredded everything in their path. Their wings were as sharp as blades and their tails as menacing as jagged daggers with the soft touch of silk. Every time they moved, the water would churn and become their spearhead, shredding skin and blubber apart as though wet tissue paper. In a single charge, each stingray had killed no less than 100 in a single sweep, and not a single one had been injured. The construct that enveloped them seemed to double for both defense and offense, without the strength to tear it apart. Harming the stingrays within was simply impossible. No matter how hard they tried, the mere gold-grade threats had no ability to cause more than a ripple on their surface, let alone shattering them apart. The air-grade constructs bellowed into the skies, but in response, Lionel just took a seat down on the city walls. He realized that he had underestimated even himself. It seemed that it wouldn't be necessary for him to raise a finger at all. Under the shocked gazes of the spectators, the first stingray construct, powered by a squadron of 10, made it to the first air-grade general. The two clashed, the stingray construct trembling wildly as the air-grade general was sent reeling backward. The howl of a whale echoing tragically as several cuts were carved out along its thick belly. The stingray's construct cracked and threatened to collapse, but that was when a second came in and rushed into the body of the air-grade general, shredding it to pieces. It was then that it finally seemed to settle in. Lionel hadn't gone from 1,000,000 gold-grade threats to just 100,000. He had gone from 1,000,000 gold-grade threats to 100,000 air-grade threats. The railing Cynthia was holding on to shattered, her fair palms bleeding as it was ravaged by cuts and scrapes. Lionel could only be described as a little monster. Chapter 2014. Published at 27th of July, 2023, 10:20 and 51 seconds AM. Chapter 2014. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2014. 2 options. Lionel pushed off the city walls, his body suddenly flickering and vanishing. His first-tier divine armor took shape, a blinding bronze aura emitting from him as the ocean's waves rose to his back. Suddenly he swung down, the mighty wave responding in kind and slicing an air-grade general in half. Lionel's spear spun in his hands. In response, the surging wave spiraled into the air like a twisting tentacle. He took another step through the air, and appeared above another air-grade general, and thrust forward. The skies rumbled and the clouds split. The spiraling wave seemed to be controlled by Lionel's might, shimmering with a slight golden hue as it pierced forward along with his spear, tearing a gaping hole through the head of another whale beast. Everywhere Lionel passed, the ocean's waves roared after him. As though his movements alone were enough to elicit their action, they responded in kind. As he danced through the skies, they too danced, a deadly waltz of murderous storms and flickering spear force causing mass destruction everywhere they went. Just days ago, Lionel didn't have nearly this much skill with water force. And yet, before their eyes now, he seemed to have become a god of the seas, a Poseidon donned in armor and traversing the skies. Lionel swept his spear out 3 times, causing 3 spiraling tendrils of water to rise from the surface. His hips pivoted and his blade glided through the air. With one thrust, the tendrils ripped through the body of another beast, then another, then another. They followed Lionel like roaring flood dragons, droplets of water falling around them and reflecting the delicate gold of his spear force. It was a scene too beautiful for how deftly it was. Even the waters below were beginning to turn a fierce violet color, dyed thoroughly with the blood of creatures far too large for their own good. The Morales ancestors watched with a glow in their eyes. They had never seen the absolute domain used in this fashion, but it was truly a sight too gorgeous for words. With the absolute domain, Lionel's spear could appear wherever he wanted given a certain range. In fact, when the absolute spear domain grew enough in strength, even displacing it through time wasn't entirely impossible. But to use this ability to make use of the power of nature itself to strengthen yourself, this was a level of spearmanship that was rare beyond belief. This was even beyond what these ancestors could do. Their spear force was, obviously, much stronger than Lionel's. But when it came to comprehension of the spear, it felt like they were actually not just a single step behind. 10 stars erupted to Lionel's back, and his divine armor shifted as he retrieved his first-tier armor and used his second-tier divine armor. His strength multiplied several times over. He unleashed a mighty roar, dragging his spear blade from a downward position and pulling it up in a wide arc toward the skies. A blinding crescent of golden spear force took shape, blasting forward and splitting everything in its path in two. The ocean's waters parted, forming a trenching several kilometers deep. The boundaries of the trench's sides were so solid that beasts caught up in it began to fall. They slipped out the sides of the trench, crashing into the darkness below and churning the waters with flesh and blood. It was a complete massacre. What should have been the difficult air-grade upgrade challenge had become nothing more than a joke. In the 3 days that Lionel was busy, others had managed to catch up and form gold-grade territories of their own. But just as quickly as they were left behind again. And this time the gap was even larger than it had been previously. It might not be an entire week, potentially 2 for some, before these heirs even thought of challenging the air grade. But now, Lionel had claimed an entire sea for himself. Lionel stood in the skies, taking a deep breath. The dense smell of the ocean filled his nostrils and lungs, leaving him with an oddly peaceful expression, even though the human domain was anything but peaceful at the moment. Still, this had nothing to do with Lionel. With a flash, he appeared in the City Lord Manor, looking at his current territory. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. He already knew that he would have control over an entire sea, a fourth of the ocean after this, but he was stunned by just how expansive the territory truly was. Just taking into account the surface, it was about a quarter the size of a supercontinent. However, if you accounted for its depth, just in a small region of the ocean previously, Lionel had found 200 challenges and almost 50 dungeons, and that had been in just a 20-kilometer range. Now, however, Lionel controlled almost 2,000 kilometers of length and just over 500 kilometers of width. There were so many challenges and dungeons that it wasn't even realistic for him to clear them all in a short time. Lionel realized that this was likely another test. Now he had to juggle the benefits of accumulation versus action. He had many resources at his fingertips, but there had to be a balance between gathering and taking part in these resources and spearheading his path toward ending these air wars and claiming victory for him. Lionel fell into thought for a moment. Seeing the sort of advantage claiming a sea held, if there was one thing he had to do, it was to make sure that no one else could gain such an advantage. There were only 2 ways of doing this. The first was by finding anyone trying to expand into the ocean and taking them out before they could take more action. But this was unrealistic. Just his fourth of the ocean was so expansive. How would he find others in the 3 quarters that remained? That only left the other method, to claim them before anyone else could. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Chapter 2015. Published at 27th of July, 2023, 10:21 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 2015. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2015. Could it be? If he wanted to take this route, he would need 3 things. The first were more city upgrade passes, the second were more unique ocean territories, and the last were territory size upgrade rewards. The second was more important than the former. If it came down to it, he could just force upgrades on his own. After passing this air grade upgrade, he had more points than he even knew what to do with. Each gold grade threat was worth 10,000 points, and there had been 300 million of them. That meant that just from them, not even counting the 300 air grade generals, Lionel had 3 trillion points. Of course, not knowing what to spend his points on was a function of not having checked what he had access to now that he owned an air grade territory. Even if he had only passed a normal upgrade challenge, it would have still been at least 1 trillion points. Lionel doubted that Ancestor Hito would just provide enough points for it to be next to useless. Even so, if it came down to it, Lionel could afford several air grade upgrade challenges now if it came down to it. So the unique ocean territories that he could pair with unique territory size upgrade rewards were far more valuable to him. The first thing Lionel did after making his decision was to check through the rewards that the others had accumulated while he was crafting and after he had fallen asleep. Unfortunately, there were no other unique ocean territories in them, but there were many gold-grade city upgrade passes, 4 of them to be exact, and there was one territory-size upgrade reward. It seemed that special territories were rarer than Lionel had originally thought, but then again, after the first few days, all of the air-grade dungeons had already been cleared, so the others had no choice but to focus on the other lower-grade dungeons. Now, however, it seems that we need to make another push. Lionel nodded to himself. The others should have already sensed the changes. Once they knew the locations of the other resources, claiming them would be exceptionally easy. As soon as they found a unique ocean territory reward, Lionel would be able to go about claiming a second sea as quickly as possible. As Lionel was lost in his thoughts, quickly planning out the next steps, the uproar of the human domain hadn't simmered down in the slightest. And that was because of only one thing: Lionel's crafts. This wasn't about the life grade anymore. It was rather about the value of Lionel's crafts. They were beyond a normal life grade treasure, and this was plain as day for all to see. When it had settled in what Lionel's crafts could do, the entire human domain was shaken. This was for a very simple reason. The only organization that had a craft even close to this was Shield Cross Stars. However, even Shield Cross Stars was wholly inferior. That was Lionel's craft now. It felt like nothing more than a joke. Cross Elder Avon's expression was as ripe as a tomato. He himself, because Lionel's could be used both offensively and defensively. At the same time, it could be used by 10 people simultaneously. In comparison, Shield Cross Star's craft could only be used defensively as it was a shield. To make matters worse, it could only be used by 3 people simultaneously, limiting its power. Despite how inferior it was, this unique craft of Shield Cross Stars had been a staple of their power for countless generations, and the secret to its crafting was one of their top-tier secrets. There was no doubt that it was the subject of jealousy for many, but seeing Lionel's craft now, it felt like nothing more than a joke. Cross Elder Avon's expression was as ripe as a tomato. He himself didn't know anything about crafting, but he had enough life experience to understand what he was seeing. However, it was also because of his lack of perspective that he also believed that Lionel must have a method of forming this armor for humans as well. If this technology was in the hands of the Morales family, who were already so powerful, just what would happen? This might restrict those with the metal synergy lineage factor, as they were already used to wearing their own divine armor into battle, but a large half of the Morales family only had the spear domain lineage factor, and garbed themselves with normal armors. What if all the spear domain lineage factor Morales members were given armors like the ones Lionel had just given the Stingrays? Would it even be possible to defeat the Morales? The words of Lionel couldn't help but echo in their ears. They had felt that Lionel was far too reckless. Even if he was confident in striking down his peers, what about the retaliation of the powers behind them? Why was he so confident? Did he really believe that the Morales family was infallible? Everything Lionel did seemed to paint the picture that he was meticulous and scheming. He wasn't the type of person to make such foolish mistakes. But no matter how they racked their brains, they felt that he was far too reckless, until now. Lionel wasn't provoking them all, waiting to run behind the shadow of the Morales family and their protection. In fact, judging by his personality, he might very well be waiting for this war. In fact, he might even want this war. They shuddered when they reached this point in their thoughts, their blood running cold. Why did Lionel struggle so much against the gold grade upgrade challenge, if he had such a trump card in hand? It seemed that he didn't even think about bringing it out until he really had no other options left, as though he was unwilling to display it unless he absolutely had to. Could it be that he had many such trump cards? Could it be that his vision was never set on the air wars to begin with because he had always felt that his victory was guaranteed? Could it be that, from the very beginning, he was only using these air wars among juniors to declare war on the entire human domain? Chapter 2016. Published at 27th of July, 2023, 10:21 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 2016. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2016. Enough. Ancestor Alvaro laughed uproariously. He laughed so hard that even the stars in the distance seemed to twinkle under the wild vibrations. He laughed so hard that he even began to cough and wheeze. Damn, I'm too old for this. Despite saying this, he couldn't stop laughing at all. He knew that this change only put more pressure on the Morales family, but the pressure had gone from all the powers of the human domain to all the powers of the human domain. This was the problem with putting all your cards on the table at once. How could they threaten them more than they already had? It was even amusing seeing their expression change like this. Ancestor Alvaro and the others were having the time of their lives. The best part was that Lionel had crafted it before them all, for a solid 3 days, repeating the same steps again and again and again, for a total of 1,000,000 times. And they still didn't understand what the hell was going on right before them. It was clear the gap between where Lionel was and where the rest of the human domain was so wide that it was unfathomable. To put this matter into perspective, more life-grade crafters would be so secretive with their blueprints that they wouldn't even allow others to see them. Even their own children weren't allowed such a privilege. While they were crafting, the entire region was locked down, and they would even often ask those who had commissioned for the treasure to bring far more materials than they would need just to keep the true materials list a secret. After such life-grade crafters passed on, it was only then that their crafts would be passed down to others in their family, but even then only the highest echelon would be able to lay their eyes on it, while the younger generation would have to provide a great deal of merits just for the sliver of a chance. Usually, unless you rose to the level of an ancestor, you could forget it. Even Cynthia, who was a great genius and could have benefited greatly from seeing a life-grade blueprint ahead of time while she was still in the gold grade, wasn't given such a privilege until she was well into the 7th dimension. Back then, she had already surpassed Tier 6. She wouldn't have even been allowed to participate in these air wars back then. If the human domain wasn't so strict with life-grade blueprints, there would probably be more life-grade crafters than just the few hundred there were, but this was just how things were. Or more accurately, this was how the Force Crafting Guild had made things. Whether it was force crafting or force pill crafting, both had the same issues, and both happened to be overseen by the Omen family. The Morales family had never needed the Omen family for force crafting, but their rules surrounding force pill crafting had caused no small amount of issues. Luckily, the Morales family could absorb ores to strengthen themselves, and they were less reliant on force pills compared to other families. However, even so, only half of them had this benefit. It could only be said that the history of the Omen and Morales family was quite long and contentious, but what was important here was Lionel and his craft. Cross-Elder Avon might not understand, but how could these crafters not? Not only had Lionel forged a life-grade treasure as a 6th-dimensional junior, he had also begun to forge again on a force crafting language they had simply never seen before, one so complex they couldn't even understand it. By this point, more than half of the best geniuses of the human domain had already been kicked out, being forced to watch Lionel, the one who had threatened them all, shine like this. They could only grind their teeth. After the amethyst token drama of over 20 years ago, many of them had a faint recollection of Lionel in their minds. But after he didn't appear for so long, many thought he had died and didn't bother to care about him any longer. As for when he actually came back, they cared even less. How could they think that Lionel could bridge a gap of 20 years? They didn't even consider it. But then Lionel crushed Conan while he was still in the 1st tier. However, they then broke through to the 7th dimension, and they felt that they had left him far behind once again, only to realize that that gap had never meant much to Lionel in the first place. The reality was slowly starting to sink in. If they hadn't been given an over 20-year head start, they wouldn't even have the right to stand on the same stage as him. The uproar of the human domain slowly faded into a solemn silence, the presence of a single young man looming tall and imposing. Lionel sensed a fragrant wind approaching, and he turned to find that Aina had already appeared to his side. Without a word, he handed her yet another spatial ring. This one held the corpses of 300 air-grade generals. She looked within and her brows raised. It was a lovely sort of blaming expression that looked more cute than it did intimidating. Clearly, she was unhappy with Lionel for challenging the air-grade upgrade while they weren't even here. The other upgrades had been one matter, but this one was quite reckless. Lionel only smiled lightly, something that he had done rarely in recent days. "What's the ETA?" Aina asked. I've decided to conquer and corner off the rest of the ocean first as a defensive play. We'll need more special ocean territories and territory expansion rewards. If things happen as fast as I want them to, we'll launch the final march to end this 1 week from now. It's enough time, Aina said lightly. Lionel nodded and Aina flickered and vanished. Chapter 2017. Published at 27th of July, 2023, 10:21 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 2017. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2017. Immediately before Lionel set out again, he paid keen attention to the changes in his abilities as the new owner of an air-grade territory. Many things were pretty standard. For example, there were upgraded outposts, and there were also some defensive measures unique to air-grade territories. Right now, the walls Lionel had access to were already quite fantastic. They were 100 meters tall and over 10 meters thick. On top of that, they were forged of a powerful metal alloy. However, other than that, they were relatively simple. Many of the options included infusing it with certain large-scale force arts that could greatly strengthen it. There were also methods of banning flight within a certain range of the city. The more he paid, the larger the range would be. What was more interesting to Lionel, though, were the unique upgrades he could gain since he had a special ocean territory. Many of these things, unsurprisingly, were related to ice. The most intriguing of them was what was called cold force. Lionel didn't think that such a force actually existed, but it must have been created for the air wars quite specifically. It was a force that could be emitted from his island and act like a domain that covered the city. Those that entered this domain would feel as though their own force was icing over. Their blood would flow slower and their bodies would become stiff. Depending on how stronger the overstrength of the targets were, one could lose anywhere between 10% to even all of their combat prowess. Would work with 100 meters of his walls, it would cost him over $1 trillion. The maximum setting, that would work for an entire 10. The price, though, was quite steep. Just for the lowest setting that would work with 100 meters of his walls, it would cost him over $1 trillion. The maximum setting, that would work for an entire 10 kilometers, cost 10 times that. That maximum setting cost 3 times more than what Lionel had. Seeing that the first thing he wanted was actually so expensive, Lionel held off on buying it immediately. That was because he knew that if one thing was actually so expensive, then most other things would be as well. After a moment, and scanning through all available rewards, Lionel realized that these outrageous prices were unique to, ironically, the unique territory rewards of his city. But it was also because of this that they were likely to be the most useful. The cold force domain was a game changer. Anyone believed the gold grade threat level would be incapacitated, and no different from fish on a chopping block within its range. Those on the weaker side of the gold grade would lose as much as half of their combat strength, while those who were the strongest would lose at least 1/10. Only air-grade threats would be capable of entirely ignoring it. At the strongest setting, costing over 10 trillion, even an air-grade threat would have a 10% reduction in their strength within a 10-kilometer range. Another unique reward was the ice moat. Lionel felt that a better name for this reward would be the ice maze. That was because it formed a maze of ice in the water that could hinder the advancement of oceanic beasts. The walls of this maze would be incredibly sturdy, comparable to about half that of the base city walls. Simply put, no single creature would be able to take down even a single wall without many hours of effort. The best part about the ice moat wasn't its defenses, but rather the fact that it forced the oceanic beasts swimming below to split up, disallowing them the ability to gang up and use their potentially overwhelming numbers. It functioned essentially like a funnel, forcing the oceanic beasts to fight alone. The ice moat would also be quite useful in case anyone came to attack Lionel with boats and the like. Although it was an underwater design, it still peeked out of the water over 3 meters or so. Unless a ship wanted to destroy its hull in a battering ram attempt, they would likewise had no choice but to follow the path of the maze. Of course, the best part was that running into a dead end wasn't impossible. At that point, you would only have 2 options: to turn back or to take the effort in attempting to knock down the wall. But if you chose the second option, you might run into yet another dead end on the other side. Both of these rewards were incredibly intriguing, but the ice moat was even more expensive. Just its most basic level cost 2 trillion more than what Lionel had. The good news was that it could cover an entire kilometer instantly, but the bad news was, obviously, that he couldn't afford it. The last unique reward that had caught Lionel's attention was a unique territory protector. It was, of course, of the air grade, but it was exceptionally powerful. This protector took the form of a star of ice. When activated, in exchange for 1 billion points, it could trigger an area of effect attack that worked like a rain of ice meteors. These ice meteors froze water on contact, and had great blunt force damage. The lowest setting could target a 100-meter region. The highest setting could attack all around the city, though it was still limited to 100 meters. There was clearly a difference between one 100-meter region and the entire 100-meter radius around the city walls. Unsurprisingly, this was the most expensive of them all at 10 trillion just for the lowest setting, and close to 100 trillion for the highest. Lionel faced a situation where he had to choose whether he would save up or not. With his army of stingrays, he could take on the air grade upgrade with quite some ease and guarantee himself anywhere from 1 trillion to 3 depending. He already planned to do this 3 more times, so if he was patient by the end of it, he would be able to afford the Star of Ice. However, Lionel shook his head. Sometimes, sitting on a pile of cash was worse than spending it. Even if you didn't do anything and were frugal, as time passed, your money would only become worth less and less. That was the way of the world and of inflation. Thinking to this point, Lionel bought the lowest setting of the Cold Force domain immediately. Chapter 2018. Published at 27th of July, 2023, 10:21 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 2018. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2018. In alliance with the remaining more than 2 trillion, Lionel upgrade the domain to the greatest setting her could, gaining over a kilometer in range and quite a bit in strength. After this he decisively left, his body vanishing. When he appeared again through a teleportation platform, he was within the territory he had left to Maya to manage. As expected of the cloud race, from the outside, it was simply impossible to tell that there was something wrong at all. They all moved and acted just like the Tor family would have. Something that left the ancestors of the Constellation family quite enraged, but there was little to nothing that they could do about it. After handing Maya a spatial ring, Lionel vanished once again, and returned to his main territory. It had already been over 3 days since his last report from the Umbra family, but just as he had asked of them, they returned quite frequently to give him reports. The more Lionel learned of the situation, the more certain he was that someone, most likely Second Nova, was stirring up a great deal of conflict. The first instance was Sixth Nova falling seemingly without warning. This left a vast and open territory that everyone immediately took advantage of. However, because Third Nova had been preoccupied with expelling Fourth Nova, he missed the boat, resulting in him falling behind the others. This felt like a coincidence on the surface, but Lionel was quite certain that this coincidence was actually a perfectly timed scheme with excellent execution. It was just unfortunate that Sixth Nova had to be the one to suffer. With Fifth Nova, Sixth Nova and Fourth Nova all gone and dealt with, there were only 4 heirs of the Morales family remaining, and only 3 of which, including Lionel, who had any real territory. As expected, Third Nova wasn't very happy about this change at all. It felt like his lead was being swallowed up, so he couldn't remain idle for long. Not long after that moment, he became the first to enter the gold grade. And while the others were scrambling to lock down and ensure others couldn't snatch their new territory, he swallowed up all of Fourth Nova's old territory for him. Due to this, Third Nova was able to make up for his slight slip, and he began making a big push toward the air grade. However, this was when the details of an explosive battle was relayed, and surprisingly, this time it had little to do with Morales' family. For some reason, this huge clash came between the Seward family and the spiritual faith. Lionel couldn't help but narrow his gaze when he read about this information. That was because he was still wondering about what danger Third Nova possessed, and whether or not he truly had a connection with the Seward family or not. Obviously, Lionel felt that observing the Seward family was one of the best ways to gain an understanding of what might be going on. For the Seward family, who had mostly remained silent since the start of these air wars, To suddenly get into a conflict with yet another power that hadn't done much since the start of the Air Wars felt off. It was almost like they were putting on a play for others. But it was also because it was so obvious and blatant that Lionel felt that it was a bit ridiculous on its face. If they wanted to scheme, shouldn't they come up with a more clever method? The spiritual faith was probably a thorn at the side of many of the most powerful powers of the human domain. How could the likes of Shield Cross Stars and the Void Palace be okay with a religion that so blatantly worshipped another race? In truth, the spiritual race was so powerful that they very rarely took the initiative to attack anyone. Even if the human domain faced danger from other races in the future, the odds that this threat would come from the spiritual race was minimal. Even so, no one had to think to answer what the spiritual faith would do if the day came that the spirituals did have such ill intentions. Just like that, one of the most powerful forces of the human domain would defect without a second thought. The Zoltene faith was similar as they worshipped the nomad race. Lionel had already personally been to one of their shrines. These people had little regard for the human race despite being human themselves. Lionel felt that there was a secret to this matter. Despite the fact he had improved so much and seen so much of the human domain by now, he had still yet to meet one of these so-called gods. The evergreen goddess, the Zoltene god, the spiritual's god, he had always thought that they were real people. His father's dictionary had made it clear that this was the case. So where were they? How could such individuals not participate in something that had captured the attention of the entire human domain? These thoughts had always been swirling around in the back of Lionel's mind, which was why when he heard about this battle that made little to no sense, his antennas were immediately placed in an upward position. However, what baffled Lionel even more was the truth behind all of this. After a lot of scouting, and even the use of many strategically placed Cloud race members, Radlis came back with information that left Lionel speechless. It turned out that Amory, the so-called sword deity, was betrothed to the heir of the spiritual's faith, or more accurately, the future Lady Pontiff of the faith. For whatever reason, both parties were quite opposed to this marriage, and they could only be described to be at loggerheads. This dislike of one another reached the point that they even fought on this sort of stage. However, after a battle that lasted the better part of a day and spread like wildfire, it settled down without a victor, and there were even clear signs of both parties freely entering and exiting their adjacent territories. Even without it being described in so many words, the conclusion was obvious: an alliance. Chapter 2019. Published at 27th of July, 2023, 10:22 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 2019. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2019 only. Lionel didn't even frown at this realization, his expression indifferent. He always moved with the worst-case scenario in mind. He already imagined that these air wars would end with him facing off against many enemies at once. Whether they teamed up now or later made no difference to him. What he cared about more were the implications. It seemed that the spirituals were uncaring about most of what happened in the universe. This was something he had become greatly aware of after reading the records of the Void Palace. There were many instances of other races attacking the human domain through the Void battlefield, but none of the spiritual race doing so. Even if a family had an alliance with the spiritual faith, it wouldn't be seen as a red flag to most. One also had to consider the stance the human domain had toward other races as well. Compared to the greater universe, the human domain was fairly lax with other races. Or at the very least, there was no systematic movement to get rid of them. The Oryx could thrive just fine while the likes of Yuri were even allowed to enter the Void Palace. This made it clear that the human domain didn't usually act against other races. However, the problem of Third Nova was making Lionel second and third guess this matter. Another interesting matter also happened to be the Seward family's lineage factor. Much like the Morales family, the Seward family had two lineage factors, not one like most other families. This was why they were seen to be on par with the Morales. They had the strength to back up such thoughts. The Seward family had the Sword Domain lineage as well as the Blazing Devil lineage factor. Oddly enough, Lionel felt that the Seward family was quite a bit like the Morales in this regard as well. Their lineage factor was very demon-like, maybe even more so than the Morales. Lionel could still remember how Amory's eyes had reddened that day the second time they fought. In the end, he was forced to suppress himself so that his tribulation didn't erupt ahead of time. From Lionel's understanding, their lineage factor similarly strengthened their bodies. Aside from that, it gave them great affinity with dark force in addition to having several other auxiliary benefits that wouldn't have been listed in the Void Library. These would account for techniques similar to metal body and divine armor. Lionel would have no way of knowing the true details until he forced them out of Amory. Then there would likely also be his ability index to deal with. Whether it was the first or second encounter they had had, Lionel knew that he had never fought Amory's best. The first time he had been suppressed by the vital star force, and the second time he had been suppressed by his tribulation. Regardless of how you looked at it, he would be a powerful opponent, and unlike with Nazag, Lionel couldn't directly strip away one of his strongest abilities. However, also unlike Nazag, Lionel had a great will to crush Amory in the worst way possible. At that moment, Lionel suddenly thought of something and his gaze narrowed. He sent a message to Radlease after a while, and threw the thought to the back of his mind as he continued through the events. After the Suyard and spiritual faith clearly allied, they once again fell into dormancy, doing nothing much more. However, not long after that, First Nova and Third Nova had their first clash. This clash occurred in the open waters, but for an unknown reason, it didn't continue to a point of no return, and they both retreated without any results. Of course, this was actually a clash between Vega and some of Third Nova's subordinates rather than First and Third Nova themselves. But Radlease had still added this to the report as Lionel had asked for everything of significance. Following this, Third Nova clashed with the Ram family. However, just when it seemed that he would claim victory, he suddenly retreated, rushing back to his territory to find that his city walls had fallen. Lionel felt that, once again, Second Nova had struck. But what he didn't know was how Second Nova had managed to do this without detection to a gold-grade territory. He could only speculate that Second Nova had taken some time to clear dungeons and claimed a gold-grade version of the silver-grade wall, destroying rewards he had previously gained. There was no easy way to rebuild the walls after they had been destroyed. The only methods were to rebuild it by hand, to find a reward that could replace them, or to undergo an upgrade challenge. But taking on the air-grade challenge without walls was nothing short of suicidal. Third Nova was thwarted again, and he seemed to be in a bad situation. After investing so much into a gold-grade territory, he couldn't just abandon it. And he had yet to gather enough points to take on the air-grade challenge, even if he wanted to take the risk. Without a choice, Third Nova could only set aside his ideas of conquest and began to accumulate. He dispersed his subordinates with the goal of claiming and clearing as many challenges and dungeons as was possible. When Lionel got to this point, his eyes narrowed. As expected, there was a clash. No, more accurately, there was a speculated clash. The Umbra family didn't manage to get eyes on it. All they could do was speculate. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. To him, it was obvious. Second Nova had diverted Third Nova's attention, giving him no choice but to spread out his army and give up his greatest advantage, numbers. Then Kira and Second Nova could take Third Nova on without the disadvantage. However, out in Morales family's flagship, the sound of a crying woman echoed. Kira's tears fell like a torrential storm, holding Orin, who was continuously coughing up black blood. Ancestor Hito opened his eyes and frowned, an expression that even the ancestors of the Morales had never seen from him. He's been poisoned. I have no method of dispelling it. This is only something that the Omen family can cure. Chapter 2020. Published at 27th of July, 2023, 10:22 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 2020. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2020. Poison. Not many had seen the battle between Third Nova and Second Nova. It could even be said that the latter had wanted it this way. He attacked right when it seemed that Third Nova was about to enter a state of slow expansion. After watching the air wars for many days already, the novelty had worn off and many were entirely focused on whichever region had the most action. As such, quite a few had no idea who had even injured Second Nova to begin with. Even the Morales ancestors were quite clueless. Since poison was used, the immediate assumption was the Pius family, and Oren and Kira did nothing to refute this. For whatever reason, they didn't want to describe what had happened, and maybe that was always the plan. Despite Kira's crying, Oren couldn't seem to hear or feel anything but a spine-tingling pain. He looked up toward the starry skies, his lips pressed into a line. Maybe he had never thought that things would end like this. Ancestor Hito was indeed correct. Maybe only the Omen family would have a method of dealing with this. While the Pius family worked with poisons, their methods weren't conventional. As they relied on their unique force and its manipulation, they didn't concoct poisons and create antidotes like many other poison masters. Instead of this, they trained their poison force to be able to do the work of creation and immunity itself. The trouble with this approach, though, was that while Pius family members could purge themselves and one another from poison, it was impossible for them to use this method on others. Trying to use poison force on someone without poison force affinity to dispel poison was like pouring oil onto an already burning fire. Even if the Pius family had been the ones to poison Oren, their help was next to useless in this regard. The only one that could help would be the Omen family and their force pill crafters. The Omen family was the only family with the skill to dispel such a high-level poison. In fact, they would probably need one of their best gold-grade force pill crafters to do the job as well. A normal force pill crafter would have no chance. That was Ancestor Hito's observation, and they understood it intimately. Kira wanted to immediately get up and beg the Omen family if she had to. But before she could even stand to her feet, she felt a strong grip on her wrist. A grip firmer than anything Oren should have been able to muster given his current state. And yet he had found the strength. The Morales family doesn't know weakness. Oren continued to stare into the skies, his expression blank and his lips once again pressing into a thin line. His grip on Kira's wrist didn't weaken, and it even seemed to tighten as time went on. It was as though he knew that he was growing weaker, so he tried his best to compensate. Kira writhed and struggled. "I'm not a Morales. Let me go." However, Oren didn't seem to hear her, his eyes slowly closing. He took deep and steady breaths steadier than anyone would have expected of him at this moment. He seemed to be at peace, his vice grip holding on to Kira firmly. A Salvatine doesn't show weakness either. The words entered Kira's ears and she shuddered, her tears falling even faster. The Morales ancestors watched with dark expressions. Oren had already made his stance quite clear. They would only be slapping his face if they asked for help now. They didn't know how long Oren would last for, but it likely wouldn't be very much time. Any poison with such potent effects couldn't possibly take too long to deal with a seventh-dimensional existence. "Who did this to you?" Ancestor Alvaro asked, his gaze red with fury. He didn't look toward the Omen family even once. He knew if he did he would lose himself to rage, and begin this war even before the Air Wars ended. In the history of the Air Wars, no Morales had ever died, not since their no-killing rule had been established. It was an event that was supposed to promote harmony and healthy competition, not bloodshed. It was these people who had forced this event to be this way. It was they who had demanded bloodshed. It was they who wanted to enter for a chance to take Lionel's head. It was they who wanted to knock the Morales down a peg, they who let their greed guide their judgment. He could imagine their snide sneers and upturned noses. They might very well have a force pill that could save Oren's life right this moment in any one of their rings, but they would never step forward to give it over. Just thinking about it infuriated Ancestor Alvaro to the point he enough to infuriate the Morales ancestors beyond compare. They should have had 7 shining beacons into the future, but now it trembled. This was one of their best generations yet. Just the loss of one was enough to infuriate the Morales ancestors beyond compare. They should have had 7 shining beacons into the future, but now it seemed that one would lose his life here. "It doesn't matter," Oren said lightly, his eyes still closed. "It will be up to First Nova and Littlest Nova now." To the side, Sixth Nova's expression flickered with a complicated light. He had indeed been eliminated by Oren, but he didn't hold a grudge. It just meant that he was inferior. He gripped his fists tight. The only thing he regretted was not still being inside to deal with who had placed Second Nova in this state. The gazes of the Morales family members all turned red one after another, the space around their fists creaking and trembling. Their fury was stifling, a different sort of silence falling entirely. It seemed that they couldn't wait to unleash their fury. The stars in the distance turned crimson and space itself quaked. This time, the Morales family was truly infuriated. Chapter 2021. Published at 27th of July, 2023, 10:22 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 2021. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2021. Lost. Oren lost, Lionel said lightly. It was hard to believe. The strength that Oren had displayed before him, albeit just a small amount, was substantial. Just to counter him and Kira, Lionel not only had to use his second-tier armor, he also had to actively use his ability index in battle for the first time in a while. Ever since Lionel left the Tribulation Zone, whether subconsciously or not, he had stopped relying on his ability index in battle. The speed of improvement he had made in the way of the spear during his time in the Tribulation Zone spoke for itself. He would just be too stubborn if he chose to ignore the evidence right before him. Over time, he was slowly finding a balance between relying on his intelligence and his innate talent to slowly move forward and improve. However, it wasn't an easy balance to find. The last time he had had a breakthrough in this regard was during his battle with Miguel. This was all to say that Oren was the first person since he exited the Tribulation Zone, and had such a big boost in his power that had actually made Lionel go so far. He had used not only all 10 of his star, he had used his 5th-dimensional life-grade divine armor, and his ability index. These three things should have practically made Lionel undefeatable within the younger generation. But he could tell that both Oren and Kira had held back a great deal. So how had they lost to Third Nova anyway? There were only two explanations. Each was dangerous for its own reasons. The first was the most obvious, and that was that Third Nova was simply that strong. Even after dispersing his subordinates, he still had enough strength remaining to take on both Kira and Oren without a problem. In this case, the problem was obvious. He was far too powerful, maybe more powerful than Lionel could fathom. If the battle had ended quickly enough that others, and even the Umber family, couldn't find out the details about it, this was a testament to how large the gap between Third Nova and Second Nova had been. The second was that Third Nova had been prepared for Oren, and only pretended to disperse his people while keeping his strongest subordinates by his side. Maybe he had even laid a trap just for Oren to fall into it. The problem with this case was that Third Nova was incredibly scheming and intelligent. It implied that after Oren's 2 attempts at thwarting him, he had already seen through the fact that someone was targeting him and took appropriate precautions. He was ready for Second Nova's appearance from the very beginning. This was shocking because Lionel had seen Oren's level of caution firsthand. In fact, now that Lionel thought about it, Oren's methods of weakening Third Nova in the beginning seemed to smell of his lack of assurance in victory. It might have made sense for Oren to try and disperse Zavnik's people, but what was the purpose of clearing Sixth Nova's territory? One could argue that was to force Zavnik into a more desperate situation, which eventually led to the outcome Oren wanted, but Lionel wasn't so sure about that. He felt that Oren had felt that he was going to lose. But none of Oren's actions seemed to line up. Why did he keep this a secret? Did he inform the elders ahead of time? If he did, why did the Morales allow Zavnik to participate? Wouldn't it have been better to deal with him directly? Lionel didn't believe that the Morales were the type of family to get tied up in tradition and red tape. They would definitely ignore their own rules if they had a good enough reason to do so. It all seemed to circle back to the same point. The only reason Oren was acting in secrecy all this time to begin with. His demon origins. How is it connected? Lionel was in the middle of a battle with an air grade while trying to digest this information suddenly came to a complete stop. He was even swallowed whole by the air grade beast, but he made no attempt to stop it, his body frozen in place. Suddenly, the air grade threat was shredded to pieces from the inside out. Lionel appeared in the depths of the ocean, his absolutely domain raging around him. Lionel suddenly took a step, his speed blazing as he shot out of the ocean like a jet, quickly making his way back to his city. He had just received news that the others had finally found another unique territory. It was time to action. At the same time, Lionel's gaze couldn't help but grow with a fiendish light. Why would Oren keep all of this a secret? The only real explanation seemed to be that exposing Third Nova would likewise assumed. There was very likely a shadow faction within the Morales that was more aware of this than others. Expose himself. If Lionel was correct, not only was the Morales family's ties to the demon race much deeper than he had originally assumed, there was very likely a shadow faction within the Morales that was more aware of this than others. There was a very obvious clue here. In order for Orin to be born, a Morales had to mingle with the demon race enough to, maybe not necessarily fall in love, but to at least copulate and have a child. This wasn't a small instance of interaction at all. In the best-case scenario, the Morales had ties to the demon race in small, benign increments. In the worst-case scenario, the Morales family had always had the roots of the three-finger cult within it. In fact, these roots were so deep that if someone like Zavnik managed to become the heir, it would be enough to shift the tides in the family so much so that those that had once been in the shadows could see the light of day once more. Lionel suddenly understood that he wasn't the only one using these air wars as a stepping stone towards something much larger. A flicker of crimson danced within Lionel's eyes. Okay, Zavnik. Let's play. Bang. Leon landed and the entire ice island boomed and quaked, threatening to shatter to pieces beneath his might. Important announcement below. Chapter 2022. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 42 seconds p.m. Chapter 2022. Water Lotus. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel appeared in his ice island city, his attention immediately turning to James, who tossed over a glass orb to him. When Lionel saw what was in it, his expression flickered for a moment. He had already guessed that the unique ocean territories wouldn't all be exactly the same, but this one was actually quite different. Of course, the name uniquely spoke for itself, but its unique attributes changed Lionel's plans a bit. At the very least, he couldn't be in as much ease as he had hoped. The unique ocean territory this time was probably more accurately called a unique water territory instead. If this was called an ice island territory, then this unique water territory would be quite accurately called a water lotus territory. Rather than forming a huge island of ice, it formed a huge island in the form of a blooming lotus. This didn't seem like a big deal, until you understood that a water lotus was a freshwater plant. While it can handle slightly salty water, specifically brackish water, which is a combination of river waters and ocean water, it wouldn't be able to live in a full-on salt body of water. In line with this water lotus territory would turn the surrounding territory into a freshwater body. The surrounding 10% of territory would become pure freshwater, while the remaining 90% would be brackish. This was actually good. If this had been Lionel's only territory, this was because there was a permanent debuff to oceanic creatures who entered this territory's waters. Within the brackish water, they would experience a 20% reduction to their strength. In the freshwater, they would lose as much as 50% of their strength. Of course, this scaled with the city's grade. A gold grade city could limit the strength of up to the gold grade, while an air grade city would be able to infect even air grade threats. However, there was a very obvious problem here. This chapter upload first at Innovel USB. C0M. Lionel's army of stingrays were saltwater creatures. As a result, they were subject to the very same debuff. This was the obvious downside of this city. There were no freshwater creatures in the region to begin with. This was the ocean. And unless you bought freshwater creatures from the Water Lotus City itself, you would be out of luck. There were fresh bodies of water on the supercontinents, but Lionel didn't have the time to divert his attention to them in an attempt to find freshwater creatures on a large enough scale for them to be useful. And there was obviously the largest problem. Lionel didn't have the time to spare to make another huge batch of armors. Lionel took a breath and exhaled, his gaze frighteningly calm. It wasn't impossible to find freshwater creatures. He owned the entire supercontinent, and thus had a method of scanning the entire territory for what he needed. The issue was that doing so was useless for the reason of time. Anyone else would be ecstatic to receive such a territory. But Lionel's own skill had ironically painted him into a corner. This situation wasn't as bad as it seemed. After all, these debuffs would be suffered by the creatures of the upgrade challenge as well. That meant his stingrays and the enemy would be on the same playing field. But the larger problem would be if Lionel was ever attacked. There was no telling if others had access to freshwater creatures or not. Or maybe even creatures who could exist in both. How pathetic would it be if he was suddenly at a disadvantage in his own territory? I think you should take a look at the other problem was that because this territory came with such a large advantage right from the outset, the benefits one could get afterward was limited. Lionel tossed the territory reward up and caught it again, his mind spinning with several thoughts. Seems that it's time to reveal another trump card. Call the commanders of the Sky's family here. It wasn't long before a long line of Sky's family members stood before Lionel. All of them had on extremely respectful expressions, which was a far cry from how things had been just a month or so ago. They were the only group Lionel had never sent out on missions, so everything Lionel had done, they had personally witnessed. The kind of strength Lionel could display at such a young age left them in complete awe. All of them were less than 100 years old, and were relatively young as a result. Seeing the difference between them let them understand why it was their patriarch had lowered his head. It's about time, you all prepare yourselves. Lionel waved a hand. Exchanging several million points, he brought out over 100 spatial rings. The generals of the Sky's family that he had appointed already knew what these rings were for. So without a word, they immediately turned and left, rushing to get into place one after another. Lionel turned back to the others. For the next half-day, stay outside this range of waters. After issuing his orders, Lionel flashed and vanished. With great speed, he found the location of waters he wanted and threw the water lotus orb out. It immediately burst from its glass orb and expanded wildly, surging out in all directions until it formed an enormous lotus. Large and thick green pads extended from the sides, while in the center, a gorgeous pink flower bloomed, its thin petals gently waving in the wind. For extra defense, the green pads could close, though it took a few hours to finish. So this had to be done well in advance. It could be said, though, that this territory was designed to be purely defensive. If he wanted it to be a death trap, it would be up to him. One after another, over the horizon, the Sky's family members dashed across the water's surface, swiftly catching up with Lionel. Lionel's gaze sharpened as he sent forward several more rewards, triggering the bronze upgrade challenge, and then the silver and gold upgrade challenges right afterward. Chapter 2023. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 41 seconds p.m. Chapter 2023. Crack. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel dispersed the challenges with instant clear reward. His gaze narrowed as the Sky's family took up their position on the large greed pads. The current Sky's family members didn't look anything like they had before. There were still only about 10,000 of them, but since the beginning of the Air Wars, they had been wearing the very same simple linen clothing. But now each one of them wore radiant armor, their foreheads fitted with a tight headband that seemed reminiscent of a simple crown. The drama on the night-side supercontinent was so great at the moment that many were still focusing on what was happening there. Especially since Lionel had entered a bit of a lull since clearing his first section of the sea. But suddenly seeing that he had gained another special territory, the expressions of many couldn't help but become serious. If Lionel succeeded, wouldn't this mean that he would claim half of the ocean for himself? Combining this with an entire supercontinent, wasn't this far too much? Many saw the clear problem with this strategy though. Lionel already had a shortage of people. What good was it to have this much territory? He should be attacking the others before they could gather any more people. This was his best chance. There was only one explanation for this. Lionel wanted to prevent others from benefiting from the ocean. It was ambitious, more than they understood. Lionel's every action always seemed filled with so much confidence. It was clear that he did nothing by half measures. He was ambitious when he needed to be. He drew back when caution was needed. He schemed better than most they had seen. And the sharpness of his mind seemed to be on another level. Subconsciously, many realized that even when they couldn't explain why Lionel was doing something, they subconsciously believed that he had a good reason for doing so. This was a subtle, and yet prominent change occurring all across the human domain. Lionel couldn't be sure of the mind of others, but he had clearly planned on this kind of change. There was a reason he hadn't just started the domain war. And momentum was only part of the reason. He was far too unknown. Most knew his father but not him. He wanted to show this human domain that his own merits were enough to crush them. This chapter upload first at Novel USB. C0M Lionel's gaze suddenly blazed to life as he fused 2 more gold-grade city cores into the Water Lotus City. Without hesitation, he shot into the air, overlooking the waters. They had become much clearer, the smell of fresh water filling the air. It was intoxicating and filled one with a sense and calm. They were so clear that one could almost see to the bottom of the ocean despite its ridiculous depth. It was an absolutely gorgeous sight. But as soon as it appeared, it vanished beneath the wildly churning waters. At that moment, the members of the Skies family all roared out at once. The clear skies above began to roll as a dense body of dark clouds began to make their way over. Their armors began to glow fiercely, strong pillars of gold light filled with lightning runes rising up and piercing the thick cumulonimbus clouds. Lionel watched this silently, unmoved by the churning lightning just above his head. The reality was that salt water conducted lightning with far greater ease than freshwater. One would think that if Lionel wanted to use the Skies family, he should have used them during his first air grade upgrade challenge instead of now. But this was actually the wrong way to view things, albeit an easy mistake to make. Lightning always chooses the path of least resistance. That meant that if one was in water that conducted it with greater ease, your odds of surviving wouldn't be lesser. It would actually be much greater. What did this mean? Simply put, the damage that could be done in freshwater was far beyond that of what could be done in saltwater. And that was because it was more difficult for lightning to pass through freshwater. And as such the odds it would choose to pass through your body instead was far higher. The moment Lionel saw that the surrounding and immediate 10% of his Water Lotus territory would become purely freshwater, it clicked into place for him. And he realized that this was the absolute best time to use the Skies family. I think you should take a look at, of course. Things weren't so simple as they seemed on the surface. Kill, Lionel said lightly. The gazes of the Skies family members flashed, their pillars of lightning expanding into the waters before them. At that moment, just as the oceanic beasts began to appear one after another, they were first hit by a wave of weakness after entering the freshwater. Then right afterward, they were swallowed up by a sea of lightning. The harrowing cries of hundreds of millions of oceanic beasts echoed as the skies flashed with arcs of lightning that pierced downward again and again. Bang, 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 rumble. The air-grade generals froze, unable to move. They writhed in pain, their skin quickly charring beneath the menacing sea of gold. Lionel calmly took out his bow and pulled back its string taut. The smell of frying flesh filled the air. The gold-grade threats could hardly last a few seconds before they were fried to ash. Only the air-grade threats seemed capable of holding on, but they were entirely paralyzed. To Lionel, they were nothing more than unmoving targets. With an exhaled, Lionel released his arrow, tearing a hole 10 meters across in the head of an enormous colossal squid. Clearing this would be even easier than the first air-grade upgrade challenge. Across the ocean, located on the ocean's floor near an underwater volcano, a city was located. If others had been paying attention, they would be quite shocked, as this underwater city was actually already at the gold grade. A rare find even at this stage. In fact, the only two with such a city were Lionel and Third Nova. Or so most thought. However, at that moment a large change took place. Ornik's expression changed, but it was already too late. Crack. The city core broke and the entire city was uplifted and shoved outward. They were expelled from the sea, their city forcefully relocated to another section of the ocean. Chapter 2024. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22:38 p.m. Chapter 2024. An hour. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Ornik stood stunned. What had just happened? He didn't even remotely have a good explanation. The more he thought about it, the more baffled he was. Was it some sort of special reward? But according to his calculations, Goldgrade should be the highest level city currently. It had to be remembered that the supercontinents only spawned dungeons and challenges equivalent to the territories it was in. This meant that if one wanted a reward higher than the air grade at this point, according to Ornik's calculations anyway, one would have no choice but to enter the ocean. This was the only place that would spawn such challenges ahead of time. Ornik didn't believe that a gold grade reward could expel his city like it had just now, even cracking its city core. Such a thing would completely unbalance the situation. So did that mean that someone had been just lucky enough to clear an air grade dungeon with this sort of reward? But even that didn't make any sense because that would have to mean that they were targeted in specific. They had been completely secretive and had definitely flown under the radar. Plus, who could even reach them currently? They only had such freedom so deep because of the rain beasts. Ornik threw that idea out and assumed that it must be some sort of large area of affectability, but just how large could it be? He didn't believe that anyone could sneak up on them, and they had already claimed a large region with their special territory, so if anything had appeared, they would have been alerted on their territory map the moment someone encroached. In order for them not to notice, the range of such a thing would have had to be enormous, hundreds of kilometers at the very least. And that once again brought him back to his original deduction. It had to be an air-grade reward. But that was impossible. Ornik took a breath and exhaled. Often, the simplest deduction was the right deduction. This chapter upload first at USB. C0M. Someone formed an air-grade territory. Not only that, but they succeeded in claiming the entire sea for themselves. As a group with a unique ocean territory, Ornik, of course, knew about claiming a sea. He was actually working as fast as possible to get to that level as soon as possible. But just when he felt like he was getting close, all of his hard work had been destroyed. No, it's not over yet. There were obviously two choices before him. The first was repairing the city through fusion while the second was attacking the person who had done this to them. At that moment, Richard and Montero flashed over from a distance. They landed in the midst of the ruined and cracked city, their expressions just as ugly as Ornik's. What the hell happened here? Richard asked. We've been targeted. I think someone used an air-grade reward to expel us and claim the sea. How is that possible? Montero's brows jumped. I think you should take a look at it's unlikely, but it isn't impossible. We've run into upgrade rewards and territory rewards. It's likely that someone was lucky enough to stumble into all three that were needed. Potentially one of the Water Force families. We would have to face off against the Constellation families eventually. You're saying someone managed to gather a unique water territory, which is already rare enough, on top of all of those things? Bullshit. That's the simplest explanation. It's also best that we go forward with this explanation, because if we underestimate the enemy too much, we'll suffer instead. Richard gripped his fists. Why did it feel like every time he was close to succeeding, he would be crushed before he could even fully rise? His gaze burned with a furious light, causing the waters to become agitated. Well, crush them now before they can gain the full benefits of the air-grade territory. They'll be in a lull right after passing such a big trial as well. In addition, although they won't know much about us, their territory map should have alerted them to the fact that they had just pushed a territory out. They won't ever guess that we'll attack them now when we've just suffered a huge blow. Ornik frowned when he heard Richard's words. He could tell that Richard was already slowly losing his patience. However, when Richard continued, his words still seemed to carry some reason. Think about it. Anyone who could find so many rewards in the ocean, albeit lucky, also took quite a bit of effort as well. They've likely taken the same strategy as us in dispersing many of their subordinates into groups to clear as many dungeons and challenges as possible. If they used an upgrade reward to reach the air grade, which makes the most sense, they wouldn't have needed to recall everyone, and they're likely to even expand their radius even further. Now that they had a territory map that expands across an entire sea, there's even more dungeons and challenges to deal with. Before they consolidate and decide to attack other territories with the gains they've made, this is the best chance they'll have, without a doubt. Ornik nodded slowly. Although he had originally felt that Richard was far too eager, after hearing his words, Orinik felt that they held no small bit of logic to them. The reasoning was sound and he couldn't find anything wrong with it immediately. Even if they were wrong and someone had somehow amassed an army that could clear an air-grade upgrade challenge the normal way already, not to mention the point total it cost as well, after fighting such a huge battle, this person would be in quite a sorry state currently. So even in the case he was wrong, there was no better time to attack than now. Orinik nodded slowly. Let's prepare. We can only take an hour at most. Richard and Montero looked toward another, clearly in agreement. It was clear that they had all agreed on this being the best step. If they retreated now, their chances of victory were next to nothing. Aside from revenge, the rewards of these air wars were far too lucrative. They couldn't give them up. Chapter 2025. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 36 seconds p.m. Chapter 2025. Large if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel slowly lowered his bow, his eyes narrowing as he looked off in a certain direction. He looked down and scanned the sky's family members. They were indeed in a sorry state. They had just maintained their domain of lightning for several hours. Although Lionel's armor made it a lot easier on them, they would need quite a bit of time to recover, unless they used the pods. Return to the ice island, Lionel commanded. Unfortunately, the outposts were always tied to a single city, as in the city they were summoned from. As such, Lionel's convenient teleportation network wasn't useful here. He would have to build up another network for this city that could bridge the gap between the two and make it more convenient. He definitely had the funds to do so, but it would take time because one had to personally place the outposts down in their chosen location. In addition to this, Lionel didn't yet know if he would have the points to spare. That was because he now had 3 trillion more points and another city to potentially upgrade. He would have to decide, once again, whether to save what he had or use it immediately. As Lionel had expected, the options weren't many for the Water Lotus territory. So many of the advantages of the territory were baked into it already that giving it any more upgrade paths would be too overpowered and break the balance of the air wars. The only option Lionel gained was one that allowed him to exchange points for a faster closing time. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M. This closing time referred to the green paths of the Water Lotus entering a defensive position. Right now, it took about 8 hours to close the paths and enter the strongest defensive state of the city. He could spend 1 trillion to half that time, 2 trillion to cut it down to 2 hours, and 4 trillion to cut it down to an hour. For every halving, Lionel would have to pay double the points. Other than this, there were no other options to gain. Lionel narrowed his gaze. He was in a bit of a situation now. He had, indeed, sensed that he had expelled someone from his territory. But just like he had sensed them, they had definitely sensed him. If they were smart, their next action would be to attack him with their full force as quickly as possible. His people were, indeed, dispersed, just as Richard had said. In addition, the Sky's family that had fought by his side were too fatigued for another round of battle. It would take them only 15 minutes for the uninjured among them to recover once they returned, but it would take at least an hour to return, and an hour to come back to his side. That was 2.5 hours total. He had just gained 3 trillion points from clearing the air grade challenge. Although there were points to be gained from the dungeons and challenges as well, those points were adjusted to account for individuals potentially having millions of subordinates to begin with. He only gained 100,000 points for dealing with an air-grade threat, while the others, in exchange for clearing an air-grade dungeon, might receive anywhere from a few 100 million to a few billion. While this might sound like a lot, one would need to clear 1,000 such dungeons just to get 1 trillion points, let alone the tens of trillions he felt like he needed. I think you should take a look at I have to release the stingrays, and let them start clearing challenges on their own. Lionel shook his head. It seemed that he would have to hold this line alone until the Sky's family could return. Unfortunately, he had also told the others to stay out of this sea due to the danger of the method he was planning on using, so it would take them about an hour to rush to him. And that was if they were wiped out from their dungeon clearing in the first place. With a wave of his hand, Lionel spent all 3 trillion points, cutting the time needed to 2 hours and beginning the closing process. He was feeling a hint fatigued after the battle himself, but the hour he estimated it would take them to get here was more than enough for him. With a step, he appeared on the edge of one of the slowly moving green paths. His bare feet dangled in the clear waters, his expression calm as he closed them, laying his spear across his lap. His breathing seemed to match the rhythm of the slowly churning waters. The reason he had claimed this city in the first place was to ensure that no one else could claim a sea for themselves. And he planned to do it twice more. He didn't care even if he had to leave the Water Lotus territory closed into perpetuity. His only goal was to hold this land. What happened with the rest of it didn't matter to him. Oddly enough, this was a rare moment of relaxation for him since the air wars had begun. Listening to the rushing waves as an army approached him, he felt an unprecedented calm. It was a calm that came from the depths of his soul. A confidence built on a track record that ran deep, a blemishless resume. Suddenly, Lionel opened his eyes. By this point, the edge of the green pad he sat upon had raised into the skies, leaving just the smallest gaps to squeeze through. However, the city was still too exposed. In order to stop someone from reaching the city core and claiming the city for themselves, it would take a great deal of effort on his part. The last hour felt as though it had passed in the blink of an eye, but the tranquility of Lionel's gaze was more gentle than even the waves of a serene lake. Even when he saw the large army before him, he was unmoved. Even after he recognized Richard and Aurinik, he reacted as though they were nothing more than air. He stood to his feet slowly, holding out his spear from his body and pointing it toward the waters below. If one drew a line from the tip of his spear to the once calm surface, it would be possible to see a gentle ripple spread out, almost as though someone had touched the surface with a finger. And yet, Lionel's spear and spear force was nowhere near it. It was as though the ocean's waters were informing the world that Lionel's presence was much larger than it seemed to be. Chapter 2026. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 35 seconds p.m. Chapter 2026. Floating cotton balls. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The scene at the front could only be described as shocking. Hovering above the water, what looked like enormous blue cotton balls floated. Each one of these cotton balls was almost a kilometer across at the smallest, and over 10 at the largest. They looked completely harmless, and yet large tendrils of water streamed upward from the once calm surface with such speed that one could almost witness the surface of the ocean dropping millimeter by millimeter. The amount of water these creatures were absorbing was absolutely shocking, and yet it didn't seem to hinder their movements in the slightest. It was clear that the Water Lotus territory's debuff was completely useless on these enormous creatures as well, and there were easily thousands of them, stretching as far as the eye could see. If it wasn't for their ridiculous size, Lionel had no doubt that there would be even more. On top of these cotton ball creatures, warriors stood. It was a mixture of Aemon, Itatsi and Viola family members. These people were relatively unknown in the human domain, so much so that many had been questioning why Lionel was sitting in silence and doing nothing at all. They had had no idea that such a lineup was coming until now. Realizing that Lionel was actually planning on facing off against such an army alone, the hearts of the spectators shuddered uncontrollably. As for Aurinik and Richard, both were very surprised that the one before them now was actually Lionel. Both had believed that this person would more than likely be from a Waterforce family, but when they saw it was the person they wanted to deal with the most, and better yet he was alone, a cold light suffused their irises. Even so, the unhurried calm in Lionel's gaze was especially grating on their hearts. It felt as though they were reliving some of the most traumatic moments of their lives. The loss of the Void Library token that Lionel had snatched from him seemed simple, but just for a chance to enter as a galaxy-ranked disciple, Aurinik had lost count of the number of times he had put his life on the line, how much blood he had shed, how many near-death experiences he had withstood, escaping by the skin of his teeth. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M, but without a single regard for anything. Lionel, that boy whose only claim to fame were his parents, had snatched something he had spent years planning for. To this day, that was still the greatest humiliation of his life. He was an exceptionally cautious person, one who only took action when he believed that he had all the cards in his hand, and yet he had been outplayed. For Richard, the hatred was even more deep-seated. His family had been destroyed and uprooted, not just once but twice. Aina had crushed his pride as a man, and the Luxniks had crushed his pride as an heir. By now, he knew that Lionel had played him, forcing him into a corner without raising even a single finger. He could sense the disdain radiating off of Lionel despite the fact the latter's expression was calm. It was a disregard so deeply entrenched that it made Richard's blood boil, his slightly graying hair dancing in the wind. Montero, the only one of the three without history with Lionel, was the only one looking around and questioning the situation. Where were his subordinates? Were they inside the city? Why didn't he sense them? But it was exactly at that moment that Orinik and Richard spoke at once. Attack. The skies above rumbled, and the large tendrils of water tornadoes that the rain beasts were swallowing up shifted. I think you should take a look at Lionel narrowed his eyes as an enormous wave of water surged toward him. They towered tens of kilometers into the skies, blotting out even the sun in the skies. There was simply nowhere to escape it. Whether it was width or height, both carried the suffocating weight of nature. A bronze aura gently radiated from Lionel as he tilted his head up. Even doing so while standing in the skies didn't allow him to lay eyes on the end of the wave. Slowly, a Tier 2 armor formed over his body trembling lightly just once before he suddenly appeared before the wall of thick water. With a roar, Lionel slashed down, splitting the tsunami in two. As he slashed, Lionel's gaze flickered. He had felt more resistance than he had expected. Although the tsunami-like wave was large, between his water force control and spear force, it shouldn't have been too difficult. But this water held a different sort of character. Lionel realized that these creatures weren't just spraying water around, they were controlling it. They were large, floating, breathing water force domains. That meant he had only just split the wave when it began to crash down around him. If it was just a wall of normal water, it would have fallen and collapsed. Even if it managed to maintain its form, it would have continued its forward momentum. But this one abruptly stopped and collapsed around him like a rain of fists weighing millions of kilograms. Lionel's gaze blazed to life and his 10 stars appeared to his back, his aura surging. He took a step forward and vanished through his starry light domain. When he appeared again, his divine armor was billowing with dense blue nebulae-like fog, his aura soaring once again. His void star 4 stars twinkling, trembling once and ripping the control of the tsunami from the wall of beasts. Lionel felt a bead of sweat fall down his brow, his heart skipping a beat. Just now he felt the tug of not just one rain beast, but dozens. They were sharing control of these waters, making stripping the control away several times more difficult than it should have been. Even so, Lionel's spear didn't pause. With a sweep, his spear followed a wide arc. The tsunami to his back became a sharp, slicing wave and it surged toward the oncoming army. However, the rain beasts made no attempt to fight back. They only continued to float forward slowly, their size still expanding. When Lionel's slicing wave hit them, their cotton bodies rippled slightly before all the water was swallowed up, and they grew another size. Lionel's gaze couldn't help but narrow. Chapter 2027. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 34 seconds p.m. Chapter 2027. Sneer if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again? Richard sneered. Even the unmodified rain beasts at this size were practically immune to water force. Let alone water force because they could expel so much water at once, their defenses were nigh impenetrable. Punching them quite literally felt like punch a large ball of cotton. It wasn't just a look, it was a feature. There was a reason the rain galaxy didn't allow them to get this large. Although they were generally harmless, when they grew to a certain size they were almost undefeatable. The only real way to handle them was to take them away from a source of water, and allow them to run out of water to use and manipulate. Then they would become no less docile than any other domesticated creature. However, Lionel didn't even have this option. Just judging by the closing green pads, Lionel was obviously trying to protect this city. If he wasn't, he would be too foolish. If there was no one here, snatching the city core wouldn't even take any effort at all. Knowing this, how could Lionel lead the rain beasts away from a water source? The entire terrain was the water source. The shore was literally hundreds of kilometers away. Although Lionel had thought about placing the water lotus closer to the shore, he would be giving up its greatest ability in doing this, that being the debuff of fresh water. However, even that was ironically useless in this situation. It had actually taken so much effort just to rip water force from the tsunami wave just now. Lionel couldn't even imagine what it would take to strip them of the water inside their bodies. Especially since there were thousands of them, easily. There are only two explanations for this. Either these beasts have a massive weakness that I haven't spotted yet, or they were trying to be secretive. Lionel couldn't see how these three had only made this much progress with this kind of trump card. If Lionel had had these rain beasts, not only would he had not needed to expose several trump cards, he would have already claimed the entire ocean for him, and would probably be making a move onto the Nightside continent right this moment. Suddenly, Lionel's gaze flickered. I see, this chapter upload first at NWSB. C0ME had found the weakness. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite as groundbreaking as he hoped. This weakness was simply that it took the rain beasts a great deal of time to reach this state. In this state, these rain beasts were easily worth 10,000 points each. It was likely that Orinik and Richard had chosen to exploit the same loophole that the Leo family had and imported them with just 1 point. Due to this, they had to grow these beasts themselves, causing them to waste a lot of time. If this time was removed, the fastest to form a gold grade territory wouldn't be Lionel, it would in fact be these three. If Lionel hadn't ruined their plans, they would also have been the first to form an air grade territory. If they had been allowed to grow undisturbed, the likelihood that they would have claimed victory in these air wars would likely have been won by them. Lionel's lip curled, his sneer seemingly entirely displaced given the situation. He didn't feel lucky, nor did he sigh in relief. He hadn't been lucky. The reason he had chosen to push forward with claiming all the seas for himself was precisely to avoid a situation like this one. This was the benefit of being proactive and knowing when to push and when to be conservative. As far as Lionel was concerned, he didn't feel like he was backed into a corner. In fact, he felt that there was no better time to deal with this threat. Lionel held out his spear just as Richard and Orinik began to feel a bubbling rage caused by his reaction. They couldn't believe that even now, Lionel dared to look down on them. But it was then that his aura suddenly pierced into the skies. Star fusion. King's might. I think you should take a look at Bang. A wild whirlpool formed beneath Lionel's feet. The crowding clouds above seemed to be under the same spinning force. A vortex taking shape both above and below him. Lionel held out his spear and at that moment his body trembled, forming a clone. Then a second, then a 10th, and a 100th. Soon, the number of Lionels seemed to dwarf even the large army before him. And they all surged forward at once. Orinik's gaze narrowed. Target that location. He had seen this ability from Lionel before, or so he thought. The technique he had seen was one Lionel had picked up from Valiant Heart Mountain. It was nothing more than an illusion of the light. But this one? A wall of water suddenly appeared where Lionel had stood. However, even after it landed, nothing seemed to happen. The other clones continued forward without dispersing, appearing around the army and attacking all at once. Right then, several Lionels appeared before Orinik and the others, his spear slicing down. Kill! Richard ordered. They stood upon the largest of the rain beasts. It was almost 20 kilometers across. Even though Lionel had appeared before them, he was still easily 10 kilometers away. It was almost impossible to even create an attack of that scale, let alone reach them. The water beneath the rain beast shifted and surged toward the oncoming Lionels. The three didn't feel like they even had to move an inch, but what happened next left them without words. Emperor's edict. In the blink of an eye, the rain beast that had been almost 20 kilometers in diameter suddenly vanished. Those spectating blinked. But when they looked closer, they realized that it hadn't vanished. No, it had shrunk back down to the size of a palm. And as for the waters, it had taken several days to absorb. It was hovering behind Lionel, as though a miniature planet. Wielding it like a weapon, Lionel / continued, his gaze filled with a menacing light. Chapter 2028. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 2028. Harsh reality. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Before Orinik, Richard and Montero could react, half of their subordinates died. It was as though everything had been reversed instantaneously. The moment Lionel had grasped the weakness and the strengths of the rain beasts, it was over. His clones surged forward, slaughtering the people of the Viola, Aemon and Itatsi family. They used a strong spatial force to dodge out of the way of the other water force attacks, and took down an enemy at a time with single strokes. The general warriors of these three families were no stronger than the Skies family. Their only real strength came from the rain beasts and their special strengths. How could they withstand even a single blow from Lionel's clones, let alone Lionel himself? Orinik seemed to see red. His immaculate style of dress immediately became disheveled as the rain of water from above ruined his perfectly groomed hair. In just a single attack, he had lost his air of superiority in its entirety. Lionel's figure flashed as he grabbed the now palm-sized rain beast out of the air. He stood silently in the skies, observing it as though the battle around him had little to do with him. Fear gripped Montero. Lionel stood no more than 100 meters from them, having crossed such a large distance as though it was nothing. Watching his people fall around him, his heart trembled uncontrollably. Unable to withstand the impact anymore, he reached for his badge, crushing it. This chapter upload first at NVUSB. C0M. Lionel looked up from the adorable ball of blue cotton in his hand. In its small size, it felt much more like a living, breathing creature. It rolled around without any sort of concept of danger, making odd blooping sounds as it rolled around. It was clear that it was harmless and as innocent as a blank slate. So Lionel didn't care to take his attention from it. Even so, Lionel didn't do anything as Montero escaped, he and the rest of the Aemon family vanishing along with him. Instead, Lionel simply looked up into the skies. "Capture him," he said lightly. Montero appeared in the depths of starry skies, grabbing his heart as he took deep breaths. He had heard Richard and Orinik talk about Lionel all the time. The amount of hatred they had toward him, and their constant fixation on revenge, made it seem as though they were on the same playing field. Although he had heard about some of the feats Lionel had accomplished while in the Void Palace, it was easily drowned out by the feats of others, or just too ridiculous to accept. For example, when Lionel cleared dozens of floors on his first entry into the Void Tower, even those that had been there didn't believe it, let alone those who hadn't. So, in Montero's eyes, Lionel was always someone that it wouldn't be a problem to deal with if they put their heads together. It was also not helpful that before all of this had happened, his confidence had been slowly growing every day thanks to the benefits he had gained from the Cataclysm Void as an owner of a world spirit. But the moment he had seen Lionel like this, face to face, witnessing his presence, the pressure he gave, his aura, Montero had entirely forgotten how to breathe. The gap was so large that he couldn't even fathom it. Even after several deep breaths, he couldn't seem to calm down at all. And that was when Lionel's eerie voice penetrated his soul. "I think you should take a look at capture him." The words echoed to everyone as though Lionel was whispering right into their ears. Just like before, Lionel had bypassed the restrictions of the Dream Force as though they weren't there. And just like that, everyone who hadn't been paying attention to this clash suddenly couldn't take their eyes off of it. Montero's eyes widened. He felt a cold chill travel up his back, and his head spun toward the Morales family. No. I survived fair and square. This isn't right. Is the Morales family going to break its own rules? The Morales ancestors weren't even looking at Montero. If Lionel actually expected them to capture Montero for him, he was sorely mistaken. He wasn't yet the patriarch, and even if he was, no patriarch could order around the ancestors as he pleased. The patriarch was a functionally lower level than them. The position was only to deal with affairs at and below the seventh dimension. They frowned a bit, feeling that Lionel was actually a little too arrogant if he believed this. But before they could go down this line of thought much further, a mass of swirling dark force suddenly appeared behind Montero. It was sudden and quick, so much so that even the ancestors hadn't sensed it until it appeared. Out from within it, a mature beauty stepped out. A long black dress clung tightly to her curves, a powerful, streamlined body hidden within. It was clear that she had more muscle than the average female, but rather than distracting from her femininity, it accentuated it, making it bolder, more exotic, more beautiful. Everything from her pale, almost transparent skin, to her rosy red lips, enticed and entranced people. Montero couldn't even react before his arms and legs were suddenly bound, even his lips being covered by a thin black silk. Mordred released a delicate laugh, one that caused the hearts of many to skip. She seemed to be quite assured in her charm, and she wasn't the least bit shy about using it, her maturity shining through like well-aged wine. With another step, she vanished into her ball of twirling dark force, leaving the line of senses for the other ancestors. No matter how they looked, they couldn't seem to find her at all. Just when everyone thought it was over, a streak of golden light appeared. King Arthur appeared for no more than a single instant, before vanishing in another streak himself. However, after a few moments of silence, the flagship of the Aemon family split into two, its members dying one after another. Silence fell over all, a harsh reality settling in. The number of subordinates Lionel had shown weren't his limit. In fact, they were very lucky that the age limit was just 100 years old. If it was just a few decades more, the world would have known the like of King Arthur and his daughter Mordred. Chapter 2029. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 2029. Two names. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The changes were sudden and shocking. Not many knew how to react to it. The strength of Mordred's dark force left many apprehensive, her escape measures deeper than anything they had ever seen before. To be able to hide from even their senses felt too ridiculous. Just who were these people exactly? But maybe even more impressive than that was cutting a flagship in half with a single bound. While the Aemon family was on the much weaker side, a flagship still remained a flagship. Just in terms of sheer size, one would have to be able to levy an attack with a range of at least an entire kilometer within a breath to succeed in such a feat. To do that even in a semi-decent world was one thing, but this was the Morales family's territory. This was a world with that easily stood at the pinnacle of seventh-dimensional worlds, with very few other seventh-dimensional worlds being comparable. It was the sturdiest environment one could be in without entering the territory of the Void Palace, or, obviously, entering an eighth-dimensional world. The brows of the Morales ancestors loosened somewhat, though there was also a hint of embarrassment for clearly taking Lionel's words the wrong way. Now that they thought about it, Lionel had never asked them for anything. In fact, unlike their other heirs, Lionel's growth to this point had nothing to do with the Morales family's resources. Even if one wanted to take into consideration the spear domain ring and the segmented cube, the former would only be able to be used by those with sharp enough senses and talent in the spear to begin with, while the latter had been passed down through Lionel's family line from the very beginning. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M. When things were put into perspective, it was actually quite nonsensical of them to think that he had been asking for them to act, especially when before the Air Wars even began, Lionel thought to return the spear domain ring and the segmented cube. The fact that he hadn't even known these two things about his own treasures meant that Velasco was still the very same Velasco they remembered. He hated to explain anything, even when it was to his own son. As for Lionel's mother, she had been restricted by the rules of the Void Palace all her life. When could there have possibly been time for him to gain the shelter of his parents? In truth, Lionel might even be independent to a fault. Ancestor Alvaro sighed. Quite frankly, he felt bad for even thinking along this line of reasoning, and his impression of Lionel couldn't help but become even better. But although the Morales family had realized their mistake, there would always be some fools who were unwilling to accept it. Nearby, the flagships of the Atazzi and Viola families swayed back and forth under the raging explosion. Fear was clearly painted on their faces, as they came to realize that their fates might very well be the same. Their only chance of victory was for Lionel to lose to Auric and Richard. But given how decisively Montero had run, was that even possible? Seeing this as a sort of opportunity, and seemingly still very much unhappy about Lionel using Cloud Race members to win a competition of human geniuses, Cross Elder Avon snorted. His unhappiness painted all across his face. You Morales are truly acting as if I'm not even here. I advise you all return the patriarch of the Amon family now. Or don't blame me for being impolite. Avon had been too far away and too slow to react to Arthur and Mordred's sudden appearance. As such, he could only watch as the Amon family was massacred. He had used his senses to scan the region for several moments, but even after so many attempts, he still couldn't seem to find the two at all, leaving him a bit frustrated. He had wanted to act against them directly, but how could he if he couldn't even find them? I think you should take a look at his role here was quite limited. He was meant to be neutral and Shield Cross Stars hadn't sent even a single genius in. Neither did the Void Palace. Or more accurately, none of the geniuses in line to become the next Void Elders of the Void Palace had participated, as they were also meant to remain strictly neutral. But due to this neutral position, Avon was in a unique position to act on behalf of the Amon family, which was clearly much too weak to defend themselves. What also helped his methods was the fact that the Morales had already gained the ire of so many thanks to Lionel's actions. If they were casually destroying weaker families now when it was convenient, it was easy to paint the picture that the Morales were trying to get rid of trouble before it became more troublesome to deal with in the future. If he could successfully accuse the Morales of such a thing, the pressure on them would only become more enormous. Of course, nothing Mordred or Arthur had displayed was even remotely connected to them to the Morales. Arthur had clearly used sword force and light force just now, while Mordred used what had looked like a wand straight out of a fairy tale. But who said all Morales had to use spears? There were many Morales who were born with neither of their lineage factors. In addition, who said they weren't relying on their ability indexes instead? With that sort of reasonable doubt, putting the bullseye on the Morales was all too easy. However, what Cross Elder Avon never expected was for a light laughter, one that was all too familiar and melted the bones as it sped up one's heart rate, would ring out at this moment. I would advise Shield Cross Stars to stay in their lane. We wouldn't want some embarrassing circumstances to leak out, now would we? Mordred's delicate and seductive voice echoed through the starry skies, but even now it was still difficult to tell exactly where it was coming from. Avon's temper was fiery and he almost immediately lashed out. You little harlot! Why don't you come out and say that to my face? Mordred laughed. Joram. Greros. She only spoke out two names, but Avon immediately went pale. Under the shocked gazes of all those present, the blustering Cross Elder, the man whose temper couldn't be calmed by anyone, suddenly sealed his lips. Chapter 2030. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 27 seconds p.m. Chapter 2030. Pawn if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Avon had been skeptical about how he and Shield Cross Stars had ended up claiming victory over such a large contingent of the Cloud Race. When he had seen Lionel suddenly come out with so many Cloud Race members who were, essentially, his slaves, he had felt that sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, that feeling that he had been led by the nose all this time. However, he had managed to ignore it, turning that sinking feeling into a will to target the Morales and blame them for their crimes. The moment Mordred's voice had echoed those two names, though, his entire world came crashing down. He didn't even know the name Joram because the moment he caught Greros, the latter had used a powerful measure of the Cloud Race to avoid interrogation, and entered a deep sleep. But the moment he heard that name, the name of the very patriarch the Cloud Race had been impersonating in the chaotic water sector, it all clicked. Joram must be his real name. The fact that Lionel's subordinates knew his real name meant that Lionel definitely knew more than he had. A lot more. Just the fact that Lionel could make Cloud Race members do his bidding spoke volumes to begin with. All of the Cloud Race members that Shield Cross Stars had captured had all entered that odd calm-like state that made it impossible for even those with dream force and mind-reading ability indexes to get into their thoughts and read their memories. Now there was simply no denying it. Lionel had been the one to lead him by the nose back then. He was the one that had manipulated them like they were chess pieces. And just when he thought he was making the Ascension Empire suffer by pulling out and making them deal with the host of problems on their own, he had ended up getting rid of Lionel's biggest problem for him while Lionel himself was probably reclined somewhere, embracing a beauty. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M. The more cross-elder Avin thought about it, the more enraged he was, but even though others could see his face turning a bright shade of red, the metal of the flagship around him slowly melting, he still didn't dare to say even a word. If everyone found out that it was actually Lionel who had been responsible for Shield Cross Star's biggest victory against the Cloud Race, a victory that he had gained so much fame and adoration for, it would be impossible to come back. They had been taking nothing but losses in recent years, and every instance of victory they had was somehow related to Lionel. And yet, they had actually placed a bounty on his head and called him a fugitive. Their image was already in the dumps previously, and it was this victory that allowed them some respite. Avin simply couldn't allow the world to learn about this. At least not now. Mordred's laughter rang through the starry skies. It was exceptionally nice to listen to, but to Avin's, it felt like nothing more than needle pricking at his eardrums. His fury could have taken tangible form if he allowed it. The ancestors of the various families, even the Morales, couldn't help but frown. Even if Avin remained silent, speculation was impossible to dodge. But at the same time, the place Lionel had in their hearts only elevated. In the beginning, it had felt ridiculous that Lionel could even compete with those of his generation. But now he was toying even with ancestors of their level. And the worst part was that he didn't even seem to have to be present to do so. Back in the Air Wars, Lionel looked down from the skies. He didn't need to guess the results. He trusted his people and had no need to doubt them. I think you should take a look at whether it was Mordred or Arthur. Both of them not only had ability indexes that were incredibly rare and powerful, they were also gifted the same talent of the people of Earth while also having access to a magic system novel to the human domain. Many of the enemies they faced didn't even know how to face them. The only enemies they had ever struggled against were members of the Cloud Race, which were far more talented than most humans to begin with, and members of the four great families, whose strength spoke for themselves. When it came to anyone else, especially within the human domain, they were on a level all to their own. Beneath the 8th dimension, their number of opponents was already very rare. Lionel rolled the rain beast in his hands again. It felt incredibly soft to the touch. He could see why people had adored them as domesticated pets. Even now, he didn't seem to take Orinik and Richard very seriously. Not going to run? Lionel asked lightly. The two clenched their fists so hard that their veins threatened to pop. Their force raged through their nodes, and their hearts pumped madly. They had no idea what had happened just now, but the fact that Lionel said capture them made them think that the Morales family had acted on Lionel's orders just now. That made them realize that there was no way out aside from victory. After a moment, Orinik took a breath and exhaled, calming heart. His hands slid into the hems of his robes, one of the very first things he had traded for as a man enamored by his own appearance, and slowly slid them off his shoulders, revealing well-cared-for dark brown skin and a chiseled physique not very much shy of Lionel's own. Richard began to age quite visibly, but his back was still as straight as a javelin. His beard grew and became wizened and gray, billowing in the wind as the hairs on his head grew more sparse and willowy. Suddenly, a dark force erupted from Orinik that finally made Lionel's eyes narrow. I see. Lionel suddenly said. You're actually a pawn of Third Nova. Lionel spoke slowly, his gaze focused entirely on Orinik. Chapter 2031. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 23 seconds p.m. Chapter 2031. Go on. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Orinik's pupils constricted into pinholes. He wasn't a fool. He could tell that Lionel wasn't baiting him. That sort of confident, indifferent gaze. As though it didn't matter even if Orinik got on his knees and swore to the high heavens that he wasn't involved with Third Nova. Told him everything he needed to know. Orinik had spent his life plotting and scheming. Even Richard and Montero had no idea where his truest allegiances lied, although Richard did know a bit more about it. And yet, with just a single slip-up, Lionel had seen right through him. Back then, when Lionel was first entering the Void Palace, no one knew who he was. Even to his own cousins and fellow Nova heirs, he was a nobody. He had never stepped foot into the family, and other than the fact they had a vague idea that he was Velasco's son, there was nothing else. There was no news about him. He had awakened his lineage factors quite late compared to the rest of them, and he was stuck far away in the Milky Way. No one had any idea he was coming to the Void Palace that year. For all they knew, he would never come. Velasco was always a wild card to begin with, and he had a huge vendetta against the Void Palace. It wasn't too impossible to believe that he wouldn't send Lionel at all. It was quite easy to accept, in fact. So the question was, how did it seem like Third Nova was prepared? Manipulating the Senate into taking action wasn't something that could happen in the spur of the moment. What about gaining information about the Raypaks, and the importance of their next round of birthed eggs? Or maneuvering matters so that the Senate could vote out the stalwart Polarm Party, and reduce them back to a legacy faction? All of these were things that took time and effort. This meant that Zavnik had to have had someone who informed him long ahead of time that Lionel was present and would be coming. And who better than Orinik, who had been sent to oversee the selection in the first place? When you looked at things that way, it almost seemed too obvious. Lionel felt quite foolish that he hadn't seen it before, but now that everything was in line, he finally felt that a weight on his shoulders had vanished. Lionel's lip curled when he saw Orinik hesitate. Go ahead and use your badge to escape. It'll only make things easier on me. Orinik shivered as he remembered the words Lionel had spoken earlier. Could it be that the Morales really had acted on his behalf? Orinik couldn't risk such a thing. He would be crushed without even knowing what happened. How could he match up to an ancestor? They could probably kill him with a single glance. Suddenly Richard roared, his fury bubbling over. A heavy black-violet rod appeared in his hands as he swung down with all his might, aiming for Lionel's head as he crossed the distance between them. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He could feel the peculiarity of Richard's violet force, and he could also feel that the latter's strength had exponentially increased just now. He took a step back and sidestepped, gliding out of the way of the strike with ease. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M. Although his strength had increased, his skill had very obviously not. Richard poured so much focus and attention into the force manipulation of his violent force that he neglected practically everything else. Even when he exchanged his life in such a way, it wasn't enough. Richard, get out of the way and support me from the back. You're no match for him. Richard's body trembled as he tried to retreat, but Lionel had already taken a step forward and swung a strong fist at his abdomen. He didn't want to kill Richard. In fact, he didn't want to kill any one of them. Of course, that wasn't because he was soft-hearted, but rather because he wanted what they had, whether that was information or their lineage factor. Lionel had no intention of gaining this violet force himself, but he felt that it was a perfect fit for the tentacle womb. What he saw in Richard wasn't a person any longer. All he saw was a resource. To his surprise, though, Richard allowed himself to be hit just so that he could gain a path of retreat. Before Lionel could pursue, he suddenly felt a hint of danger, causing his gaze to narrow. He stopped his forward movement and clasped both hands onto his spear's body, blocking to the side. Bang! Lionel's wrists trembled, but his feet didn't move. Across from him, Orinik wielded two sabers that Lionel couldn't take his eyes off of. Those sabers were definitely the very same twin sabers that Second Nova had used. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted and Lionel's gaze turned malevolent. He was uncaring and indifferent a moment ago, but all of a sudden even the air itself seemed to freeze over. He knew that Second Nova had lost to Third Nova, but he hadn't thought that the latter would have been defeated badly enough to lose even his weapons. Not only had he lost his weapons, but Zavnik was even leisurely enough to pass these sabers off to Orinik. In truth, these sabers were quite bland and unassuming. Most people, even crafters, wouldn't be able to tell them apart from mass-produced instances of such weapons. But who were normal crafters compared to Lionel? He could practically see a craft down to its molecular details with a single glance. If Orinik hadn't already been exposed before him, he would have most definitely been exposed here. I think you should take a look at what happened to Oren. Lionel's voice was as dark as an abyssal hell. Orynik's gaze narrowed once more, but he didn't say anything, his gaze flashing with a greenish-violet light as an explosion of poison fog filled his surroundings. Lionel immediately recognized this as poison. His mind moved faster than Orynik could fathom. With a quick shift, he swapped places with one of his clones in the distance. He covered several kilometers in a single thought, leaping far outside the range of its influence. That poison. Lionel felt that this wasn't a pre-concocted poison. It had come right from Orynik's body as though it was a lineage factor or ability index. But what surprised him was that Orynik could even produce such powerful poison. Where had that come from? It's branching from his dark force. Is Orynik a demon too? Something isn't adding up. Lionel had met poison demons before. He had steered clear of them. The truth was that Lionel was probably immune to most poisons. Even the ones he wasn't immune to, he had cleansing waters to deal with. However, due to the current state of things, he didn't carry the segmented cube around him. It was needed to mass produce and process ores. It was also the main source of water and food that his people had. It had to be remembered that due to the suppression of this world, everyone reacted like normal third-dimensional existences would. They needed to sleep once a day, they needed food, and they needed water. The only way to deal with these easily was to use the segmented cube. As for Lionel's own personal immunity that came from his various lineage factors and powerful Scarlet Star Force, he was a bit hesitant to use them directly. He had already learned that in the dimensional verse, underestimating your opponent was a great way to suffer. Lionel's pupils constricted and he coughed out a greenish-violet fog. He looked up to find that his clone had already been burnt to ash. Orynik's laughter echoed through the air, his face contorting in a fashion that those familiar with him had never seen. Lionel understood immediately. This poison was more sinister than he had originally thought. It couldn't be helped. This was only the second time he had fought a true poison expert, while the first one had been fought by Aina while he watched. That was back when Aina had fought the heiress of the pious family, Simona. But Aina was entirely immune to all poisons due to her ability index, so it was obvious that this experience wasn't as helpful as it should have been. Orynik's poison was able to target him through his force alone. It was incredibly mysterious. There wasn't even a direct connection between himself and his clone, and yet he had suffered anyway. Lionel's gaze narrowed and he immediately circulated his Scarlet Star Force, making use of its destruction characteristics to target the poison. But his pupils could only constrict when he realized it was useless. In fact, the poison clashed with his Scarlet Star Force for a moment before the stalemate was suddenly broken. The poison using his Scarlet Star Force as fuel to attack the rest of his body. The echoes of Orynik's mad laughter boomed across the skies. I've waited too long for this. Since you've already exposed me, there's no need for me to hold back any longer. Orynik's lips spread with a wild grin. Go on and use your badge to escape. Returning Lionel's words to him, he felt an endless satisfaction. Chapter 2032. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 2032. Without hesitation, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's clone vanished into a push of green ash. Along his own body, greenish-purple veins began to grow larger and larger in size. He was already incredibly vascular due to his metal body to begin with, but now it was exaggerated to the point of being grotesque. If not for the fact his divine armor was still applying pressure, restricting their growth, it might have looked as though his entire body was covered with squirming, snake-like tumors by now. Even so, Lionel's expression was still cold. He already realized the issue. The Scarlet Star Force he had used just now was from his smaller node. It was only at the 5th dimension. There was a far cry from the 9th dimensional Scarlet Star Force in his much larger innate node. The limiting factor here wasn't Scarlet Star Force itself, but rather his own limitations. He had thought about allowing his smaller node to grow larger many times, but having a weaker form of Scarlet Star Force in his body made it very convenient to study it. It was akin to simplifying a complex math problem. In addition, It made things much easier on his body when his Scarlet Star Force was weaker. That said, the last time he had improved his Scarlet Star Force innate node was well before he had formed this level of metal body. He knew well that his body could withstand far more now than it could before. In addition, his control over Scarlet Star Force now, after his most recent breakthrough, was akin to night and day. This poison. Interesting, poison and venoms alike might have a wide array of differing functions, but they all had one fundamental goal: to stop a portion of the body from working as intended. The methods by which they could do this were almost too numerous to count. This poison worked by attacking the most important system in the body of a dimensional practitioner, and that was the force nodal system. Of course, this system was just an extension of the circulatory system, and could be said to be the same thing. It fed on force, catalyzed its own creation, expanding while also forcing blood to pump faster and faster. Usually when blood vessels dilate, blood pressure drops and blood flow slows. But this poison took on the best of both worlds. Not only did it dilate blood vessels, but it increased blood pressure. Lionel couldn't help but narrow his eyes. The worst part was that any attempt to get rid of this poison through force, unless you had a very specific kind, would only end in making it far stronger. That said, in the midst of Orynik's mad cackles, Lionel suddenly flexed. His control over his body wasn't something the likes of Orynik could even fathom. In one sweep, he forced all of the poison pumping through his body toward his larger kidney. This wasn't even difficult for him, as it didn't require changing any of the way his body functioned. Blood was meant to be filtered through the kidneys to begin with. The moment the poison came into contact with his larger innate node, and even his smaller of the two, it was crushed. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0 in the blink of an eye. Lionel went from a bulbous mess to a normally sized human once again. Even so, Orynik's laughter only grew more uproarious. In his estimation, the same thing that had happened to Lionel's clown had happened to him. He had blown up like a balloon, leaving nothing but a rain of green ash. Of course his armor had shrunk back down. There was nothing pressing up against it any longer. The only reason Orin had lived for so long was because he had recognized the poison and stopped using his force immediately. In fact, he had even expelled what remained of his force from his body, leaving him especially weak and vulnerable. But Lionel, like a fool, thought that he could brute force his way to health. He had made the most foolish decision he could have possibly thought of making. However, Orynik's laughter came to a frightened halt when Lionel suddenly rotated his shoulder, as though he was stretching it. Lionel didn't make many more movements than that, but it was already enough for the entire battlefield to become pin-drop silent. Lionel was lost in his thoughts, wondering about something. I wonder if it's possible to create antibodies for a poison on the spot. I have a great deal of control over my body. The sharper my mind becomes, the more of it I can control. But enlisting a specific kind of antibody, Lionel felt that it would be difficult. He didn't have that degree of freedom with his body yet. But Aina probably did. Well, her body reacted immediately, and she would form the antibodies necessary. If he had her in his dream world as she did so, he could probably observe the process and copy it. He could use Dream Class to enter a state similar to hers and counter every poison. It was a working theory, but his main goal for this wasn't to save himself, although there was some degree of importance in that. After all, as he learned most about force manipulation, the more he realized how dangerous people could be. There was definitely a poison master out there who had a force that Lionel's Scarlet Star Force couldn't handle. Having such an ability would be important to counter such a person. But even more importantly than that, Lionel was worried about his subordinates. If he could manifest antibodies to help them, then have Aina refine them into a detoxification force pill, his army would also become immune to poisons. I think you should take a look at poison masters were incredibly rare, and he had a good relationship with the only family in this air war that had them, so he had neglected this matter. He couldn't allow this to happen again. He would only make a mistake once. It should work. There's about an 80% probability. It still needs to be refined a bit, but in another few hours I should have a perfect method. That way countering Third Nova in the coming battle will be easy. Lionel snapped out of his thoughts and looked up, seemingly only now remembering that he was still facing off against Orinik. Anything more to say? He asked lightly. If that's all, I'll send you only your way now. Lionel took a step forward and Orinik suddenly took a step back. His gaze was filled with the incredulousness of the situation. Orinik was very well aware of just the kind of strength behind that poison. If he realized it even in the vicinity of an eighth-dimensional expert, there was a great chance that they would be incapacitated for a long while. Of course, his force manipulation was still too limited to kill such an expert, but in the time they were immobile, he could definitely escape. However, not only did Lionel withstand it, he seemed to have recovered even faster than they would have. His momentum hadn't suffered in the slightest, and he looked as though his aura was just as robust. Orinik grit his teeth. This was already his greatest trump card. Usually he would save it, but the moment just now was too perfect and he had even succeeded. He hadn't seen a future where all of this would actually be completely useless. Taking a breath, Orinik calmed himself. Run. That was the only way out of this matter. Without hesitation, Orinik turned and fled. Richard was somewhat caught off guard by this change and hesitated. Orinik had just told him to back up and support him from the back, but now he was running? Richard felt a deep disgust within him when he thought about having to run away once again. How many times would he have to run? How many times did he have to suffer this same exact fact? All sorts of disgust and nausea rippled through his body. Tears of humiliation streamed down his cheeks as he turned, shooting through the skies after Orinik with the faster speed he could muster. Lionel raised his foot and suddenly vanished, appearing before them in an instant. Weren't they a bit too naive to believe that they could outrun someone with such high attainments in spatial force? It was nothing more than a childish dream. However, when Lionel blocked Orinik, his gaze couldn't help but narrow. In his hand, he held a familiar device, a sundial. Orinik held a grimace on his face when he saw Lionel appear so fast, but Lionel could see the twinkle in his eye. Even now he was clearly scheming. What Orinik didn't know was that he couldn't possibly match up to Lionel's speed of thought. In that brief instant, Lionel had already realized what Orinik was planning. In fact, from this plan, Orinik even potentially baked in the possibility that Lionel would realize what he was doing. There was only one place Orinik would teleport to in this moment for safety, and that was Third Nova's territory. If Lionel got caught up in the teleportation, he would be alone in a hostile continent, surrounded by his third eldest cousin's army. Orinik was banking that if he went, Lionel would either be caught up in this trap, or in the case that he realized ahead of time, he would be too scared to go. Either way, he would escape. Lionel sneered, taking a step forward without hesitation. Orinik activated the teleportation, swallowing up all three of them. Over the horizon, Aina and the others just caught up in time to see Lionel vanishing before their eyes. Chapter 2033. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 19 seconds p.m. Chapter 2033. An hour if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 2033. An hour. Lionel's body flashed, and his vision sharpened. Others couldn't maintain their sense of direction in the middle of a teleportation. One would end up feeling weightless, and would become unable to tell which direction was up, which was down, and where left and right was. However, Orinik had miscalculated. Not only could Lionel maintain his sense of direction, even his vision wasn't obstructed. He could feel the swirling mass of space splitting open before him. Lionel had known that he could do this intuitively, but this was the first time he had truly done it. He could feel that his comprehension of space was shifting and molding to the changes around him, but he quickly snapped out of it and suddenly reached forward. Orinik, who couldn't see or orient himself at the moment, felt a suffocating pressure squeeze around his throat. At first he thought it was just an oddity of the teleportation, but when his vision cleared, his pupils couldn't help but constrict. To his horror, Orinik looked forward to finding Lionel right in front of him, his throat clamped down. Right to his side, Richard was in a vice-like grip as well, both of their feet dangling from above as they struggled to push blood flow to their brains. While practitioners of their level could last a very long time without breathing, That was only if their blood continued to circulate normally. Lionel's palms weren't just restricting their breathing, his fingers clamped down on the important blood vessels of their necks, making them feel lightheaded as they struggled. Help! Help! This was Ornik's only option. He felt that they should be close enough to Zavnik's territory now. Calling out should bring down hell upon Lionel. In fact, because he had brought Lionel, he might not even get punished for this failure. Ornik could tell that while Zavnik was hyper-fixated on first and second Nova as his only competition, only he knew that Lionel was a true monster. Ornik had tried to explain these matters to Zavnik in the past, but the latter simply brushed it off. How could third Nova believe that a sixth-dimensional existence could threaten him? Then again, Ornik had a hard time understanding what it was that Zavnik was thinking half the time. Even now, he wasn't 100% certain of what his plans were. All he knew was that he needed help right now, and a lot of it. So long as Zavnik could come with his army, there would be a chance for survival. Lionel should also be smart enough to know that he wasn't a useful bargaining chip, so he just had to. Ornik froze, his body shuddering. This location wasn't right. Oh, you've noticed? If I can orient myself in a spatial tunnel, you think I don't have the ability to step out of it early? Did you think I would let you drag me into such a trap? Lionel tilted his head somewhat, his smile light and inviting. But at the moment, it looked like nothing more than a reaper's kiss to Ornik. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M, you know they say that scheming is useless in the face of absolute power, Lionel continued. And I think that's actually true. But the difference is that the definition of absolute power from person to person differs greatly. To you, I've long since reached that level. Against me, no amount of planning, no amount of preparation, no amount of scheming would be useful. Ornik felt his heart shatter. It wasn't literal, but his body felt like it had lost all of its strength. Hanging in the air, looking into Lionel's eyes, feeling his cold indifference, he realized that the boy back then he could have crushed with a single hand had long since soared well beyond him. If he had only known that the Lionel he met back then was a young man who hadn't even been in the dimensional verse for even a handful of years, he would have understood things much more thoroughly. They had simply never been on the same level. To his surprise, though, Ornik felt his badge shatter. It wasn't him who had done it, but clearly Lionel. Richard's heart was even more dead than Ornik's was. He didn't even react to his badge shattering, the blacks of his eyes sinking deeper and deeper. He had well and truly lost. Ornik felt a sharp pain before he disappeared, feeling that something had been gouged out of his body, but he didn't have the luxury of thinking about it. He already knew that the moment he left, he would find himself in the hands of others. His life was pretty much over now. Lionel didn't care very much about the feelings of the two of them. He had always been a compassionate person, but he was just as easily able to turn it off against the people who targeted him. He didn't blame Richard in the past for what he had done. Back then, when the latter tried to marry Aina, he hadn't even cared to go and stop the marriage in the first place, so how could he retroactively be enraged by such a thing? What he hated Richard for was not for this, but rather the rumors he had spread about his mother. That was simply unforgivable. If it wasn't for Eleanor telling him that he was more useful alive back then, Lionel would have long since killed this person. But then he had the audacity to hold a grudge and target the Ascension Empire years later. Then there was Ornik. The rumors he had spread back then about the authenticity of Lionel's amethyst token were true enough. Lionel wasn't enraged by this. He was enraged by the intention behind the action. And then the further steps he took to profit from his and Aina's life and death after they had entered that dangerous zone. The two of them didn't deserve his sympathy and he didn't care for it. They were only alive because they were more useful that way. I think you should take a look at as for the sharp pain that Ornik had felt before. Lionel looked down at his hand to see a bloody organ. It was a gallbladder of sorts, but this was filled with poison. But what was interesting is that when it was implanted into a body, it worked almost a lot like an innate node would, but this innate node was capable of evolving. It was fascinating. Lionel didn't believe that Ornik had been born with this organ naturally. He had found it by scanning Ornik's body with his dream world, and around the location this was found there were almost unnoticeable irregularities. This meant that this wasn't an original part of Oranic's body. Somebody implanted it? So they gave him this ability, he wasn't born with it. But how could it be so seamless? Who has the skill to? Lionel's gaze narrowed. It had to be Third Nova. In fact, it was very likely that Orin had been poisoned as a result of this, and that was why he had lost so easily and silently. Orinic wasn't a demon, but somehow he was able to gain demon-like characteristics through this method. Lionel shook his head. Just what was going on? The Silver Empire had ties to demons. The Morales family had ties to demons. The Seward family likely had ties to demons. The Three-Finger Cult had ties to demons. What was the story behind this? Was the demon race infiltrating the human domain like the Cloud race had? Something wasn't adding up here. It didn't make any sense to him at all. Why did so many powerful existences have ties to the one race that was the most evil? There wasn't even a religion that worshipped demons, at least not out in the open. This was how against demons the human domain was. Even the spiritual race could have such a religion, but the demons had never been allowed such a thing. And now there were even people creating demons? Lionel was truly speechless. He didn't have an answer for any of these matters. With a frown, he stepped through the air. Beneath him, there was still nothing but vast ocean. He had stepped out of the spatial tunnel long before they made it to the continent, so he actually wasn't very far from the Water Lotus territory. After returning, Lionel saw Aina, who rushed over with a slightly worried expression on her face. However, Lionel only smiled. I have some work for you. Can you create an antidote for this poison? Aina nodded. I can do that. You'll need to send one out of here for Orin. You'll probably need to make it more potent though. I'm only about 60/40ths on whether or not they use the same poison. But if I'm correct, it's like the same derivatives, but just far more powerful. Aina nodded. She didn't know who Orin was, but she assumed that he must have been Second Nova. Lionel at least kept them updated about certain things. Give me an hour. Those paying attention to this situation were rendered speechless. An hour. They looked toward Orin's body. He had been silent for a long time, but his skin was already turning a terrible black-purple color that wasn't natural in the slightest. Even his sweat had begun to turn toxic and foul. This person was already at a point that only an ancestor of the Omen family could cure him. How could a sixth-dimensional little girl possibly have a solution in an hour? But under the astonished gazes of those there, Aina actually cut the bloody organ open and swallowed the contents. Chapter 2034. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 2034. Where? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2034. Where? Aina stood in silence for a while, but to the surprise of many, her expression didn't change at all, nor did she erupt into a burst of ash. She didn't seem to have ingested any poison at all. Even if she was immune, she should have at least felt some pain, but she didn't react like that in the slightest. There were certain ability indexes that could allow one to be immune to certain poisons, but everything had their limits. They couldn't fathom why it was that Aina would be so confident. Even those immune to poison wouldn't necessarily go out of their way to consume it, let alone so much of it in a single sitting. Of course, how could these people know that Aina was used to far more pain than this? As a child, she would probably be thankful if she could spend a day with this sort of pain. It wasn't until she consumed Lionel's cleansing waters for the first time that she reached a state where that pain instead became itchiness, which was far easier for her to handle. Plus, Aina had the ability to subconsciously understand everything she was about to put into her body. If she looked at the poison once, she obviously knew the moment she touched it whether it was within her capabilities to handle or not. After several moments, Aina nodded to herself lightly. She listed off quite a few things. At least these territories will be useful for something. Lionel said, looking toward the Water Lotus territory. All of the previously planned force pills obviously had materials that were likewise previously prepared by Lionel. He wouldn't leave such things up to chance. However, this poison was obviously a curveball, and unlike metals, Lionel didn't have a large supply of force herbs. However, the water lotus territory had them available for purchase. It was a function that he had ignored because it was of little use to him. After all, Aina was the only force pill crafter of adequate skill that Lionel had by his side, and she was already swamped with work. While force herbs could have some effect on their own, those that would be worth it were far too expensive. Lionel was already beginning to feel the pinch of a lack of points currently, so he didn't want to waste the few he had. That said, now this was a matter of life and death. It wasn't just Oren, but his armies as well. If he wanted to face off against Zavnik, he needed a counter to this poison. If he didn't have one, he might as well pack his bags now. Even he needed a counter. Although he could rely on his innate nodes, it wasn't good enough. This poison still eroded force away, and there were many entry points to his body that it could use. If he had to circulate his force to his innate nodes first before he could get rid of it, over time, the amount of force he would lose in doing this again and again would be too much. Essentially, it would drain his stamina far faster than it should. This chapter upload first at Inovel USB. C0MIF Orinik had been smarter. He could have used the poison like a continuous domain to drain Lionel over time. But the first problem with that is that draining Lionel is only an option you could take if you were confident in surviving until he was out of stamina. The second problem with that would be Orinik running out of poison. Clearly, this wasn't a natural part of Orinik's body. Aina had to drain the entire rest of the contents to understand everything she could about it. That likely meant that there hadn't been much left. But this didn't mean that Zavnik wouldn't be able to do so. So Lionel observed Aina very carefully. He had every intention of paying close attention to her changes, to see if he could come up with a perfect counter. After buying 2 sets of materials, one for Aina, and another for Anastasia to grow in bulk, Lionel began to watch Aina. She didn't seem to mind. In fact, she felt an odd sort of peace with Lionel watching over her. Although they were in the middle of the ocean, it felt like home. She pressed 2 fingers against her brows and then extended them. From between her brows, a strand of thick reddish gold liquid came out. Just from the faint smell, Lionel knew that it was blood, but aside from that, it also carried the hint of a fragrant flower smell. Those who were watching couldn't help but shudder. A blood refinement method? It wasn't that they had never heard of such a method, but it was so impossibly rare that there wasn't currently even a single other person who could use such methods. In fact, it was so rare that maybe only a handful of others had been capable in the past, all of whom were blood sovereigns. At that moment, the entire atmosphere around Aina seemed to shift. They had vaguely seen already that her strength was abnormal, especially for a 6th-dimensional existence, but they had still felt that Lionel was too reckless in taking her as his partner rather than James or someone with more substantial and obvious strength. They thought that Lionel had put too much thought into a statement entrance as opposed to actually surviving. However, these thoughts seemed to fall to silence at this moment, a heavy one. While many still felt that Aina was too weak to have been Lionel's first choice and partner, just this ability alone was enough to be shocking to an extreme. Aina's red gold blood flew forward and formed a new structure. It took the form of a multi-layered rose with no stem. In place of a stem, there were tendrils of golden roots, stretching out toward the force herbs in the surroundings and enveloping them. I think you should take a look at the gold color seemed to become contagious, moving from the roots and swallowing the force herbs up. As the roots returned to the floating, layered rose, faint bits of dust and ash fell. They were almost imperceptible to the naked eye. But the ancestors of the Omen family couldn't help but feel their heart skip a beat. Those were definitely the impurities of the force herbs, but that was a process that should have taken several hours, several days even. It could be said that this was the most important step. In fact, this was what would decide the grade of the force pill, even more so than the fusion process. But it seemed like with a simple touch, Aina cleansed the force herbs, leaving them with nothing more than perfection. Or had she? The roots retracted and vanished into the layers of the rose. The rose itself began to gently spin, one after another. Its layers collapsed and gained a more and more golden color. A rich fragrance began to fill the air, but the process remained delicate and smooth. The The shocking realization that a sixth-dimensional existence had just refined seventh-dimensional force herbs hit the spectators like a speeding meteor. They had been so distracted by everything else that they hadn't had the time to fathom how that could even be possible. Suddenly, the last layer of the rose collapsed and closed softly, leaving the form of what looked like a yet-to-bloom flower. Sparkling motes of golden light gathered from the surroundings, and Aina gently lifted her hand. The grace of their movement left one mesmerized. Whether it was the gentle beauty of her long, slender fingers, or the elegance of their movement through the air, either one left one without breath to breathe. And then the motes condensed. Silence ensued as the rose stopped spinning, its petals opening up one after another to reveal the floating mass of 3 thumb-sized green pills covered in complex purple force arts. Aina smiled lightly, looking up toward Lionel. Finished. Lionel nodded and took the 3 pills. He held 2 between his fingers and palmed the third in his other hand. Looking up toward the skies, his gaze suddenly sharpened as he struck out the palm that held the third force pill. It rocketed through the skies with an inconceivable speed, vanishing through the layers. Up above, Ancestor Alvaro waved a hand and shook his head. He didn't know how this kid sent an item through the barrier, but he really didn't seem to care about the optics. This Lionel was so reckless, but it only made Alvaro chuckle. The only problem was whether this pill would actually work. How could he not be skeptical? He looked toward the Omen family, but they were a blank slate. Even so, the fact they were looking over made Alvaro feel a bit of curiosity. Although Alvaro was hesitating, Kira was most definitely not. She rushed over and demanded the pill, so he could only helplessly release it and watch as she shoved it into Oren's mouth. At this point, Oren's eyes were tightly shut, and he had no understanding of what was happening around him. When he sensed someone prying open his mouth, he wanted to fight back because he thought that it was from the Omen family. He didn't want it. But fortunately, he was too weak at the moment to have a choice. The pill was forced into his mouth, and silence fell. Even the Omen family couldn't help but look over. Despite their earlier confidence, after seeing Aina refine, they couldn't say anything for certain. Just where had this little beauty with such skill come from? Chapter 2035. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 2035. My wife. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2035. My wife. Oren's body suddenly convulsed. Before anyone could react, he shifted violently to his side, dry heaving twice before a sudden belch of grotesque purplish-black gunk flew from his mouth. He vomited again and again, his body unable to contain itself. All of his muscles contracted at once as though the sole purpose of his body was to violently heave again and again. Oren! Oren! Kira wanted to rush forward to help, her tears still streaking down her face, but she was stopped by the other ancestors. This is a good thing, Ancestor Alvaro said with a peculiar expression. While it looked like Oren's situation had only gotten worse, the fact he was throwing up such foul material meant that his body was actually actively purging itself. For those who didn't quite understand force pill crafting, this was still quite novel. But to those that did, it was absolutely shocking to the greatest degree. This was akin to the difference between medicine and a vaccine. Aina's pill wasn't just curing Oren, it was giving his body the tools it would need to survive this poison should he ever encounter it again. Normal detoxification pills might target the poison and neutralize it. Then over the next several moments to even days, weeks and even years, the now benign poison would be slowly excreted through normal waste removal procedures. However, the effects of Aina's pill were strong and immediate, and it could be seen that it was using Oren's body as the engine to drive the change. This was fundamentally on a different level. To not only medicate an illness but to give one the power to counter it. And to do it with a poison she had only just come in contact with. The shock was strong and immediate. The ancestors of the Omen family were stunned silent. There was only one grade of pill that could do this. Due to Aina's odd refinement method, it had been difficult to tell. Unlike with crafts, there were simply too wide a range of possibilities for force pills. One could exhibit their skill in anything from culinary skills to potion making, all the way to the creation of actual pills. Due to the wide range, it was difficult even for experts to grasp the methods of another taking a different path from them immediately. But now they were absolutely certain. Lionel's team didn't have just one life-grade crafter, it had two. And both of them were in the 6th dimension. This chapter upload first at USB. C0 Ma life-grade force pill crafter was even rarer than a life-grade force crafter. In fact, in the whole human domain, there were only 3 of them, and 2 of them were on the side of the spiritual religion faction, while the final was the most senior ancestor of the Omen family. There were no blueprints for life-grade force pill crafting, and the methods of refinement tended to change on the day-to-day basis, and even took into consideration the person who would be consuming it. If a life-grade treasure was able to be a single cohesive unit, akin to a creation of the universe itself, a life-grade pill was designated as a product of the reaction it had in the person who consumed it. Essentially, a life-grade force pill was capable of eliciting a life-grade level change in the body of the person who consumed it. In the past, Oren had been clearly vulnerable to this poison. But from now on he would be entirely immune to it. This was the power of the life-grade force pill, and maybe the most immediate and shocking change. However, this wasn't anywhere near the first time Aina had done this. Back in the Cataclysm Zone, when she refined the demons into force pills that caused permanent and foundational changes to Lionel's body. This was also an example of a life-grade change. Adding to one's strength was easy as a force pill crafter, but improving one's foundation and reworking efforts they had accumulated in the past was on an entirely different level. A crafted treasure would always be an external item, but a force pill that could so fundamentally change the very anatomy of a person was akin to a holy grail. These sort of pills could build armies, they could make up for weaknesses, they could even create lineage factors. And yet, this little girl in their eyes, with so much strength and potential at her fingertips, happily smiled at Lionel, and followed along with him without a word. At that moment, the name Aina suddenly skyrocketed to the top of every list imaginable. Even the likes of Cynthia had never been able to compare, even at her height. The difference was large and obvious, plainly so. Cynthia was a force crafter and a force pill crafter. However, while she was a life-grade force crafter, the life grade of force pill crafting had evaded her grasp for countless decades now. She had long since entered the 8th dimension, and yet this 6th-dimensional young lady had already surpassed her. I think you should take a look at the weight of this matter was absolutely enormous. If the Morales family crowned Lionel as their next patriarch, didn't this mean that the Morales family would gain Aina as well? The value of such a thing was beyond Aina herself, but what experiences she had. Couldn't she guide a generation of force pill crafters for the Morales family? The most shocking part of all of this was the fact that Aina didn't have the guidance of anyone. The Omen family had produced life-grade force pill crafters in the past. Their documented experiences were all there for their future generations to benefit from. The spiritual religion also benefited from such a thing. Not to mention the fact their race made them more in tune with the life grade to begin with. However, who had guided Aina? She had made it to this level all alone. The unique insights she likely had were things that the others had probably never even heard of. Setting aside her blood sovereignty, just this matter alone was enough to make the eyes of many light up with absolute greed. Suddenly, the air wars that were designed for the future generation of leaders had been co-opted by a young woman who wasn't even among the heirs. She could have very well created her own force. Just on the virtue of her status as a force pill crafter, leagues of people would flock over from all walks of life. But here she was looking at Lionel now. Many couldn't help but feel annoyed. How had this happened? Oren heaved one last time before his eyes snapped open, the shock within evident. Others didn't know much about this poison, but he most definitely did. He could feel that his tolerance toward it had shot way up, and on top of that, he was already in tip-top shape. If it wasn't for the fact his muscles were a bit sore from the contractions, and his force had yet to be replenished, he would even say that he was at 100%, 110% even. Ooh, how? Oren was the leader of an information network. He had information about all sorts of things and was knowledgeable on even more topics. He understood that the pill he had just consumed wasn't a normal gold-grade force pill. But the Oman family only had one life-grade force pill crafter. It couldn't be that that person had come out, right? That didn't make sense. Ancestor Hito hadn't. It was because they didn't do business with humans, especially not the most powerful among them. They wouldn't even consider it. If it wasn't for the fact they were so powerful, this eyesore of the human domain would have been dealt with a long time ago. The shock that Oren was already speaking and moving about hit like another train. Those around had already lost the words to speak. All they could do was look toward the air wars, their hearts shuddering. Not a day had passed by without Lionel giving them a surprise that left them in complete silence. Just how many more surprises did he have? Lionel descended from the skies above, and then toward Aina with a light smile. "They're jealous of my wife," he said in a joking tone he hadn't used in a while. To Lionel, the most important thing would always be Aina. He had been willing to doom the world for her. So how could he maintain his seriousness toward the air wars to her detriment? What Queen Beauty list? Could such a list even be allowed to exist if his Aina wasn't number one? Let alone the fact she hadn't even been on it to begin with. How could such a list have any sort of integrity? Aina rolled her eyes. "Stop playing around, there's still work to do." "Yes, ma'am," Lionel said with a laugh. "But first, those people with no life better make sure that my wife is the number one Queen Beauty from now on." Aina scoffed and forcefully took Lionel's hand, a sweet smile blooming on her face when she turned to pull him away. Chapter 2036. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 14 seconds p.m. Chapter 2036. Toying if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 2036. Toying. Lionel's words sounded like a joke, but he was actually quite serious. He didn't believe anyone should be ahead of Aina, and that probably had little to do with how she actually looked. If he had seen a physical manifestation of the Queen Beauty list without Aina's name on it, he would have destroyed it on sight. Luckily for the list and its voters, though, Lionel had never actually stumbled upon it. As such, they got away with a light scolding instead. Despite this matter already being considered to be over, the rippling waves that it caused didn't seem intent on settling down anytime soon. But even beyond the existence of Aina herself, the Morales family and their speculation about Oren was a different matter entirely. After Oren had regained his bearing, sitting up, and eventually standing up under his own power, he found that everyone was around him, their gazes questioning much of what they had seen. Lionel's voice was quite clear when he mentioned Third Nova. If both Orinik, a supposed subordinate of Zavnik, had this poison, and Oren had also fought a mysterious existence that poisoned him with the same thing, it was clear how these two things might be connected. Although it was just a casual word on Lionel's part, even the ancestors of the Morales hadn't realized that they had begun to subconsciously believe in even these casual words. Lionel himself had begun to hold a weight that he hadn't in the past, and the cascading effects of that matter were only growing more obvious by the day. Oren, though, still didn't seem to have any intention in exposing anything. With a smile, he only said that it wasn't Zavnik's fault. After all, they were in battle. Considering his state of weakness, had Zavnik wanted to kill him, he would already be dead. The Morales ancestors seemed to accept this explanation as well. After all, Oren couldn't even move, and there weren't exactly rules against using poison in the air wars, and it also wasn't like others hadn't had near-death experiences in the past as well. Plus, Zavnik didn't have the same abilities Lionel had to communicate through the barriers and send things, so it made sense that he didn't send any antidote. He didn't have the capability in the first place. So with that, things seemed to have been concluded. It was only Kira who stood in silence with a furrowed brow, her face still very much hidden behind a mask that only revealed the slits of her eyes. She knew that this failure weighed a lot heavier than Oren had let on. They had been preparing for this matter for a long while, and since this approach had failed, it meant that they would need to take the measures that Oren hadn't wanted to now. While this matter was settling, the lives of Orinik and Richard had seemingly been forgotten. With the distraction that Aina had provided, everyone was too enamored to realize that the flagships of the Amen family and Viola family had a striking lack of their patriarchs despite the fact they had been ejected long before Aina had sent out the force pill. Now there were three: Richard, Audiobook, and Montero were all chained, stranded in a foggy world of black that left them breathing hard. It felt like every time they tried to fill their lungs with air, a weight would be pressing down on their chest, slowing down their attempt. It made it exceptionally difficult for them to catch their breaths, and even worse than that, they had the uncomfortable feeling that they couldn't take a deep breath at all. This matter left them unsettled, and their eyes continuously darted around, as though they couldn't even see one another despite the fact they were sitting side by side. This chapter upload first at NWSD. C0 Mat. That moment, a beauty stepped out from the shadows and gazed upon them one after another. But what made their eyes widen was the absolute monstrosity standing by her side. He must have been at least 4 meters tall, with skin as red as blood and muscles as tight as steel cords. He had 4 arms and a set of jet black horns that were almost impossible to pick out in the darkness. If not for the redness of the skin causing them to spot the abnormality, they might not have realized that this creature had horns at all. Of them all, Audiobook was the most shocked. That was because while Richard and Montero only felt fear, Audiobook felt not only fear but an understanding toward the kind of creature that was before him. There was no doubt in his mind, this was a demon, a true-blooded demon. He almost fainted, flashbacks of a past he wanted to forget running through his mind with no regard for his peace or sanity. The hole in his stomach from where Lionel had ripped out his poison sac began to ooze with thick, black blood. As a seventh-dimensional existence, that sort of wound, especially since he hadn't lost any vital organs, shouldn't have left him so vulnerable. He could last for a long while even if it was never treated, weeks or months even. Even if he had to continue to battle, he could do so. But given his state of agitation, he seemed to be making the situation far worse. If others knew what he knew, they would likely be reacting like this as well. He felt as though he wasn't a chess piece on just a single board, but many of them, and it was suffocating him down to his very core as though several hands were wrapped around his heart. Mordred raised an eyebrow, and then waved a hand. An arm of darkness manifested and slapped Audiobook across the face, snapping him out of his panic attack. Audiobook was many things, but weak-minded wasn't one of them. It was just that the current situation was a lot for him to bear given his past. After he had been shocked awake like this, he began to force himself to calm down. However, even after a long while, the trembling of his hands gave himself away. The demon to Mordred's back crossed his forearms over his chest, feeling a bit annoyed by the weakness being displayed here. If not for Mordred's orders, he wouldn't even be here. I think you should take a look at so you recognize this big one, huh? Audiobook's lips trembled. How could I not recognize a true-blooded demon? Oh, a true-blooded demon? Why don't you tell me what that is? Audiobook had no choice but to reply. Demons were an odd race. If they were to be described, they would be a lot like how many legends of Earth describe dragons to be. They were exceptionally promiscuous, they spread their seed everywhere, and the number of variations of their kind depending on the species and races they had mixed with were nigh infinite. This was why Lionel had never run into 2 demons who looked identical. Each one seemed to have a wide range of mutations they could or had undergone. If the demon race were to be said to have one ability, it was that they could mesh well with most gene pools, and the mutations that resulted from them were usually positive. In this way, demons and humans were actually a lot alike. Both didn't have a set path or direction. It could even be said that they were 2 sides of the same coin as a result. That said, the demons were better off because of one class of them. True-blooded demons. True-blooded demons were akin to ancestors of a pool of demon blood. If you took a family tree of all the demons in existence, along with those with traces and portions of demon's blood, and you traced them all back, when you reached the starting line you would eventually find a true-blooded demon. These were demons whose blood hadn't been mixed with any other races. A demon that was the purest in the truest of sense. These demons were known as true-blooded demons in the dimensional verse. In the Cataclysm Zone, these demons were known as Chaos Demons. This might be a shocking realization, especially since Lionel had already fought Fiend-class demons, and almost lost his life to one, while Chaos Demons were a class even above that. But this wasn't the proper way to look at it. It was less accurate to look at Chaos Demons as an almighty class of demons, and more accurate to look at them like blank slates without restrictions to their potential. It was very simple. When one looked at a demon and couldn't immediately tell their grade or talent level at a glance, this was a chaos demon. The strongest of chaos demons were the reason why the Cataclysm Zone held such fear toward the race. The weakest of them weren't even as good as lower demons. However, even then, chaos demons were treasured existences in the demon race even if they were weak. That was because if they mated with a powerful existence, their child was guaranteed to be powerful as well, something even the most powerful of spirituals couldn't guarantee. This sort of chaos of choice and possibility is exactly what the demon race embodied, and it was where their strength came from. And now, somehow, such an existence was before Orinik. Given what he knew, how could he not feel like he had been played for a fool? From the very beginning, Zavnik had been toying with him. That had to be it. Chapter 2037. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:22 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 2037. A single line. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2037. A single line. This matter seemed to be a simple matter. The ability to guarantee a powerful offspring so long as one was a true-blooded demon didn't seem to be a big deal. After all, there were powerful children born to powerful parents all the time. Wasn't that the purpose of lineage factors to begin with? Wasn't that why certain races seemed to be stronger than others? Wasn't that how things worked anyway? But no, this wasn't true. Of the current 7 Morales heirs, only 2 had fathers who had participated in previous years, Lionel and Adderworth. Even when one lost the heir wars, one would still be extremely powerful. Many of the current ancestors of the Morales family were former losers of the heir wars. Such individuals were still people with 2 lineages, still people with a great amount of talent. They would still be greatly nurtured. They would still be greatly beloved. These were men who would often have many wives, and many more children than that. And yet there were only 2 who had such previous lineages. In fact, this matter was such an anomaly that the fact Lionel's line had produced 3 in a row of exceptional talent was almost unheard of. Not to mention the fact that Lionel's father's generation actually had 2. His father and his uncle, both from the same father, his grandfather. This was why the human race was so far behind others. It wasn't just that they had too many paths to follow and pick from and didn't have a single set leader. It was also that because they weren't all following the same path, the odds of producing exceptional talents in a certain path were also lower. Other races not only had trillions upon trillions to bolster their population, but because they followed pretty much a single set path, there was a larger pool of talents to gather from as a result. In the human domain, a child who had great affinity with the Morales way of practicing might be born in a small 6-dimensional family, who practiced lightning force. And because they had no talent in lightning force, they would have to forge their own path outside of the set plans of their family. This was a problem one would see again and again. In the demon race, though once a true-blooded demon was born, the path and talent of the future child could be hand-selected. This made true-blooded demons, or chaos demons, the nobles of their race regardless of their personal strength. This was the main difference. Although the demon race followed countless paths, just like humans, because they could hand-select and practically create the talents they wanted, the effect it had on them weakened significantly. In fact, they got the best of both worlds, both a great deal of versatility and a great deal of talent. This chapter upload first at Innovel USB. C0M. The weight of this matter was something that Orinik was all too familiar with. That was why he felt that he had been played. From the very beginning, he was caught in an internal struggle of the demon race and he hadn't even known. Of course, this conclusion was entirely false because Lionel's demons had nothing to do with the demons of Zavnik, and potentially the hidden underbelly of the Morales family. The two were entirely unrelated. But how could Orinik know that these demons had come from a mythological zone, and not the demon domain? Mordred, who had been asked to interrogate Orinik and the others by Lionel, fell into contemplation. She was quite an intelligent woman. The moment she had seen Orinik's reaction, she knew that something was wrong. Things weren't adding up. After all, Orinik had the poison sac of a demon transplanted into his body. Could he really be this scared just by seeing one in person? And then there was this true-blooded demon name. She had never heard of it. There was clearly something much more astonishing going on here than she had originally assumed. Why don't you tell me what you know and we can make your life a little comfortable? Mordred bent down, balancing her thighs on the heels of her feet. Smelling her orchid-like breath at such a close distance, Orinik felt his heart stampeding in his chest. He had never been so sensitive in the past, and he had seen a lot of beautiful women, but right now his mind was in a mess and his body was in survival mode. Control was the last thing he had. To her surprise, Orinik actually spilled everything. Orinik, though, didn't think he had much of a choice. That was because in his mind, if demons were here, and Zavnik was also with the demons, they must be wrestling for control over the Morales family. Now that he had been captured, Zavnik would never trust him again. While these demons probably knew enough about these matters that his small bit of information wouldn't move the needle much. After all, they were basically on the same side anyway. I think you should take a look at there was a large difference between the clashing interests of internal struggle and the outside pressure of two enemies with vastly different family cultures clashing. As Mordred listened, she only became more and more serious. By the end of it, her body was tense and her lips were pressed into a thin line. The worst part of all of this wasn't the facts of what Orinik had said, but rather that what he knew was likely nothing more than the tip of the iceberg, and yet it could still make her feel so apprehensive. Mordred stood to her feet. Look after them. She said this only out of habit. Considering they were within her shadow world now, these three simply had nowhere to go unless their comprehension of either dark force or spatial force was deep enough, and clearly, it wasn't. After a while, she passed on the information she had gained to Lionel. Lionel had been focused on gaining control over a third sea as quickly as possible. The fact that Orinik and the others had been so close made his sense of urgency even greater than it had been in the past. It was actually good news that Orinik was tied to Zavnik, because that more than likely meant that Zavnik's greatest investment into the ocean was co-opted by Lionel. But that was enough for Lionel to relax in the slightest. In fact, it was very much possible that Orinik wasn't his greatest investment at all. It was hard to tell just how deep Zavnik's schemes ran, and while Lionel only had a few months to prepare, Zavnik had had over 2 decades. The gap was tremendous. However, when Lionel got word back from Mordred, everything came to a stop. He stood in the middle of the ocean in silence, his mind running 1,000,000 miles a minute. Mordred's information confirmed all of his speculation, but it had also added something he hadn't known about in the first place, and that was a secret of the Morales family's Holy Land. Orinik didn't know anything about the specifics. All he knew was that the root of the Morales family's metal synergy lineage factor was likely hidden within. Only Morales ancestors were allowed to enter this deep as it held the key to unlocking the final door of their lineage factor. The problem was that most didn't succeed and all of the current Morales ancestors, except for one, still only had 7th-dimensional metal synergy lineage factors. That one person was Ancestor Hito, and he was one of the very few to have succeeded. The target of Zavnik and the others was entry into this place, and that required a change in the rules of the Morales. Until now, only ancestors had been able to appear, but because of a change that seemed to create a door beyond the 8th-dimensional door, opening the gates to the 9th dimension, there was no better chance than now to loosen the rules of the Morales. When Lionel had learned of this, he realized that Zavnik had likely gotten this opportunity because of him. Who else could have been responsible for the creation of the final door if not him? However, he didn't blame himself too much. The fact that Zavnik and his faction had been planning this for so long meant that whether or not he had caused this, they would have acted without a doubt. But the question was, what was the goal? Were they trying to steal it? But if stealing was their goal, why loosen the rules in the first place? Did they think it would be easier if the Morales were more lax with their regulations? Suddenly Lionel froze. He thought back to the connection between the Silver Empire's lineage factor and the Morales families, and then further about the Silver Empire's connection with the Three-Finger Cult. Could it be that this secret of the Morales was similar to the chalice, the fire, and the wooden ball? At that moment, a violent spark of lightning surged through Lionel's dreamscape. It connected so many thoughts and ideas that the lightning appeared even in his irises. It was as though his entire dream world had been enveloped by a violent storm. He began to connect memories that he hadn't thought about in more than half a decade, bits and pieces of information he hadn't even deemed important, things that he had only casually thrown into his dreamscape just for completion's sake, never thinking that they'd actually become useful one day. And then he made a single line of connection. Joan of Arc, Merlin. Ability Index, Force Arts. Monkey's death. Transplanted demon organs. The Silver Empire. The Three-Finger Cult. The Morales. Earth. Chapter 2038. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 55 seconds p.m. Chapter 2038. Project. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2038 Project. The second ever zone that Lionel had entered, and the first one he had entered with Aina by his side, was one he slotted away in his mind as the Joan Zone. This was a zone he was transported back in time for, and one that had been very close to becoming a unique zone due to outside interference. But in the end, whatever had been about to trigger this change stopped and didn't follow through. In that zone, Lionel met a bishop, and he learned about a man that both said Bishop, Joan, and her adopted brothers called God. This God was able to gift them a great deal of power they could never imagine. These powers were things that Lionel immediately recognized to be ability indexes. This so-called God was able to copy the ability indexes of others, distill them into force arts, and then pass them down via a tattooing and branding method that allowed these ability indexes to become a permanent part of themselves. Of course, Lionel had also noticed that these force arts also carried a monitoring aspect to them as well. Back then, Lionel had had no choice but to allow one to be branded onto him due to the circumstances, but it was also something that he had long since gotten rid of. Not long after that, Lionel exited the zone, and was caught up in a whole host of trouble before he ended up on the side of the Slayer Legion, and entered the Camelot zone alongside many others, even including some of the Aderna family. In that zone, every one of the Aderna family had died with the exception of little Nana, whom Lionel had saved. But it was also as a result of those who had targeted the Aderna family in the first place that things had gotten out of hand. Although Lionel recalled that zone to be a mythological zone, the reality was that it had long since become a unique zone. Within the Camelot zone, Lionel had entered Merlin's trial, and even up until right this very moment, he still had the reward for that trial in his mind. Although he hadn't used it in a long while, when he meditated upon the natural force art, he was able to call down auspicious air, entering a deeper state of focus and benefiting from twice the benefits with just half the effort. Then there was Monkey. Monkey was one of the savants that had been in the same group with Candle, Vice, and most importantly, Lionel, the prisoner who had believed himself to be Lionel. Monkey was a savant with the ability to double things. It was a simple ability that was extraordinarily overpowered. In an instant, he could exponentially increase the numbers of himself and his strength. The only reason Lionel had been able to defeat him was that he was naive and not used to his power yet, and as a result easily hurt himself using his ability. Back then, despite defeating him, Lionel had still failed to kill Monkey and had no choice but to store him within a snow globe where his regeneration abilities were stalled. However, years ago, when Lionel decided that he wanted to give Monkey a chance to live a normal life just like Candle and Vice had, and he summoned him out, Monkey spontaneously died. Lionel was absolutely enraged when this suddenly happened, because he felt that he had been plotted and schemed against. There was no reason for Monkey, who had such powerful abilities, to suddenly die in such a fashion if there was no foul play involved. However, there hadn't been anything that he could do aside from using the silver tablet to transfer what was once Monkey's ability to the tentacle womb. This chapter upload first at a novel USB. C0M. Since then, he hadn't found any clues or potential answers to the shocking question of back then. Then there was Orenix transplanted organ. It was only a vague line, but it was eerily familiar to Lionel. Familiar enough that he was quite baffled by it all. This sort of power-gifting ability was something that he had only seen casually done once before, and he hadn't heard a word about this god at all afterward. What was shocking about this was that during the Merlin trials, Lionel had met the people of the bishop. One of their people, Aeliard, had questioned him about why he wasn't following the way of the bishop if he was branded. But the issue with this was that it was a mythological zone. It wasn't like the Joan zone where one could just go back in time and place people and wait for an event that connected the past and present. It didn't make any sense. Camelot wasn't a real place, so how could you send people into it? But if Camelot wasn't a real place, then how could Lionel have entered it? Then, how could Mordred and King Arthur come out with their people and become citizens of Earth without issue? What was the difference between those two events and someone infiltrating? What was he missing here, exactly? That was when it all came crashing down. A single kernel of information, a single pointed memory, a single remembrance that hit him like a falling tsunami. The Cataclysm Zone. Lionel had only spent a handful of months in the Cataclysm Zone, not long at all. He had only spent a fraction of a second returning to the human domain, after he found a method of connecting back. And yet, that fraction of a second resulted in the loss of over 2 decades to him. A truly devastating loss to most. He hadn't thought much about it back then. After all, zones always had different time dilation situations, and this was also the first time that anyone had ever escaped from a zone that had been closed off to begin with. It made sense for there to be certain distortions in time. But, I think you should take a look at zones didn't work that way. If anything, less time should have passed, not more. It didn't make any sense. When Lionel entered the Joan zone, months had passed within, but only days passed on the outside. When he entered the Merlin zone, it was the same. The only zone where this wasn't the case was with the Valiant Heart zone, but even then, the time was 1-to-1. The idea of a zone having time that passed slower than that of the outside world didn't exist. It was even safe to say that it was entirely unheard of. Lionel knew this, but he didn't have an explanation for it. He could only ignore it because he didn't like thinking about things that he didn't have a reasonable chance of coming to a conclusion on. Since he didn't have enough of an explanation, it was all useless. But then these bits and pieces all began to slide into place, slowly connecting with one another. The Three-Finger Cult. Of their 3 founders, only one had died. They should have been established countless generations ago. And yet 2 of them still lived and breathed. One of them even still in the process of targeting the people of the human domain. And maybe even the entire dimensional verse. Wouldn't it make more sense for these people to be alive if for every second they experienced, decades passed here? The tribulation. How could there be more than one spear domain? Whether it was his own understanding, or even the records of the Void Palace, there had only ever been one. If there was more than one spear domain ring, there should have been more than one bow domain ring as well. So why did the spirituals have to steal it from the Constellation Bow Alliance? The spirituals weren't a warring race to begin with, or else they would have likely already conquered the whole of the dimensional verse. It felt odd that they would take such a stand for something that wasn't even unique. The Valiant Heart Zone. How had Lionel found that ring so coincidentally? And how had a ring that had been in the hands of such an insignificant figure led to a treasure like the Silver Tablet? A treasure even capable of resurrecting the dead, and treating the lives of real people, as though they could be bargained for and bought. God. Lionel knew so much about force crafting now. He had already touched upon the life grade. He had already entered a state where, although he had yet to climb it, he could see where the peak of force crafting lay. And yet, even until this moment, even though he had personally seen the methods of crafting, he still couldn't even begin to understand how he would turn an ability index into a force art. Such methods were so far beyond himself that he couldn't even fathom them. And yet he already felt like he was approaching the limits of the universe. So how could such a person even exist? A person who could gift an ability index with a tattoo, who could change one's constitution with an organ transplant, who could resurrect the dead with a wave of the hand, and even breathe life into fictional characters. Just what level would such a person be at? This god? Maybe even these gods? Where were they? Why was it that there were so many religions in the dimensional verse? Religions he thought had stemmed from experts who had followed the god path. And yet he hadn't seen or heard of even a single one of them despite having already rubbed shoulders with the ancestors that stood at the pinnacle of it all. There was only one thought that gripped Lionel's heart and refused to let go. There was an old riddle of ancient Earth that he had heard of before that left him chuckling. If technology reached a point where one could perfectly simulate an infinite number of Earths, would there be a reason to not do it? Even further than that, what if the fate of your world depended on one of these simulations bearing fruit? The Cataclysm Zone wasn't a zone at all. This was the zone. The dimensional verse Lionel had known his whole life was no different from the pages of the fairy tale that the legend of King Arthur had been written down upon. The Dream Project. Chapter 2039. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 53 seconds p.m. Chapter 2039. Questions. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2039 questions. Lionel stared off into the distance. Nothing about the current state of his expression seemed to paint the proper picture of what was going on in his mind right now, nor did it describe the kind of shocking realization he had come to. This sort of realization wasn't something that could be brushed off casually. It was akin to finding out that the entire life you were living was nothing more than a fictional tale, a paper-thin fabric of reality that was no different than what was written out on a piece of paper. However, there were also reasons that Lionel's mind didn't collapse in on itself beside the fact that he was strong of purpose and of heart. It was quite simple really. He had been to the real world, he had stepped foot into it, he had fought their geniuses, he had enraged their experts, he had taken their benefits. All of it. He had done it. It wasn't a helpless case without a light at the end of the tunnel, nor was he as confined as a stain in a petri dish. He still had some autonomy, although he wasn't aware of what extent, and even if it wasn't to a full extent, there was still a chance that he could break free completely given enough time. These thoughts were enough to calm Lionel and keep his heart at a steady beat. However, that didn't mean that he had come to the end of his questions. If anything, he only had more questions. For example, the four great families. How were they a part of this? If they were running the simulation, why were they sending people in to begin with? Was it because their goal was to gather the most powerful humans? Taking a step back, this simulation had all kinds of races. There were spirituals, nomads, Raypaks, dwarven people. The list was endless. So who had started this simulation and what was the purpose? If it was started by humans, then what was the point of the other races? Was it so that they could grow under the conditions they would need to survive in the real world? After all, there would be a large number of races on the other side. It only made sense to force humans in these simulations to face off against them as well, and only take those that had come out on top. But then why were the four great families so hostile? There were simply too many potential answers to this. It could be that while this simulation was started by humans, it wasn't by the four great families. For example, it could be the Fox family that they had destroyed, and maybe his grandfather was even involved in it all. That would explain the old man's exaggerated strength, and how he had somehow gained it so quickly. Many spoke about the genius of Velasco, but it had only been 30 to 40 odd years since Earth had metamorphosed. And yet Emperor Fox already had the power to expel an ancestor-level character from Earth's territory. It could also be possible that while the four great families had begun the simulation, their goal was to control the powers that came of it. They were used to being the top dog of the real world. So how could they allow one of their creations to so casually surpass them? This chapter upload first at USB. C0. I'm even setting that aside. What about the three-finger cult? Lionel was now more than 90% certain that at least two of their founders had come from the real world. That was why their lifespans felt nigh infinite. If a fraction of a second could cause more than 20 years to pass here, then of course, generations would pass without them dying. But what was their goal for interfering with this simulation? Could it be that the three-finger cult was the main enemy of the people who had created this simulation of life to begin with? Could their goal be to sabotage? Maybe hindering the efforts here was easier than attacking in the real world? Lionel couldn't help but remember the oddities back then when he and Aina prepared to escape. Not a single top-tier expert had been there, only those of the seventh dimension and below had been present at all. He didn't think much about it then, But given how important that event was, he felt it was much weirder now. What Lionel didn't know was that those top-tier experts had been called away by a shocking event occurring, and as a result, they couldn't be present. However, he could guess as much regardless. If so many experts couldn't be present for such an important event, it goes to show just how much they have on their plates. That means that whatever enemy they're facing is enough to occupy even such powerhouses for extended periods of time. Since their disappearance was so sudden, it might even mean that that penultimate moment was coming forward quickly. For all Lionel knew, very soon, the plug could be pulled on the dream project and the individuals within would either be discarded or forced to come out and fulfill the purpose that had been originally intended of them long ago. Then Lionel couldn't help but think back to his odd interactions in the Tribulation Zone. He was almost 100% certain that those geniuses came from other simulations now. And if he thought about it even further, given the way they were tiptoeing around the issue, it felt like they were aware. Lionel wasn't the only genius in all of existence, and he wouldn't be the only one to run into such oddities if those of the real world were interfering so frequently as well. He didn't believe that he would be the only one to reach this conclusion, and he might not even be the only one who had come to this conclusion in his own simulation. I think you should take a look at. In fact, given the way his father moved and went about things, Lionel could almost be certain that Velasco was in the know about this matter. He was very much aware, Lionel was confident. There are two important clues here that I can use. The spear domain ring and the tablets. Both of these things are oddities that seem to exist outside the span of the simulation, and even seem capable of connecting them. The spear domain ring was obvious as its tribulation connected Lionel with other dimensional verses. As for the tablet, especially the silver tablet, its existence was more subtle, but it was important to note nonetheless. Lionel couldn't help but feel that his entrance into the Valiant Heart Zone was no longer a coincidence. It might even be tied to how the Valiant Heart Mountain of the past had been a participant in the Air Wars, and how that further connected them to the Morales family and the Three-Finger Cult beyond. But the most baffling question of them all was, why wasn't he dead right now? It was obvious by his previous speculations that there were other people in simulations that were aware, so just knowing wasn't enough to die. In fact, being aware might give you extra points. The real reason he was asking why he wasn't dead yet was because of one woman. The demoness. Every time he thought about her, he could feel a pair of eyes looking back. This woman's dream force affinity was so high that she could probably move into and out of these simulations as she pleased, and she could most definitely kill anyone who thought of her with a thought. Lionel could feel that if she wanted to, even reading his mind from such an impossible distance away wasn't out of the realm of possibilities. She might just not care to. And yet here he was, exposing things that should have been great and shocking secrets, but all he could sense was an eerie smile. He could almost see those cherry lips curling, that indifferent smile a person would have as they watched their puppy run around in their backyard, playing with a ball without knowledge that they were entirely fenced in. No matter what he did, no matter how he pushed and pulled, no matter how he struggled, there was no escaping it. Lionel closed his eyes, his breaths came deep and slow. In these last several moments, he had thought of so many questions that he didn't have the answer to, and completely unlike him, he had actually entertained them for so long. It was clear that despite what he said, this was a matter that bothered him deeply, so deeply that he couldn't even properly control his own mind. Something he had always had perfect reign over. He wouldn't allow this moment to cripple him. There were too many questions here, not of history or fact, but rather of morality, of philosophy, of existentialism. Was he a real person? Was King Arthur? Was life even as valuable as he thought it was if one could create such a world with the wave of a hand? Where did it start? And where did it end? Who was Lionel Morales? Chapter 2040. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 2040. Infuriated if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 2040. Infuriated Lionel's eyes opened. An unreadable expression within. It was hard to tell that such thoughts were going through his mind at all. And quite frankly, the The few who were watching him at all only felt that he had been taking a small break, a break he probably deserved. Maybe even the likes of those who were aware of the secret of the dimensional verse couldn't fathom that Lionel had just deduced such a thing. With a step, Lionel's figure vanished. When he appeared again, he was within the abandoned territory of Orinik and the others. It was a cracked gold-grade city, but it was still a unique territory. This territory was special because it was truly underwater. They called it the Atlantis territory. It was an interesting name since Atlantis was a legend of Earth. But considering the names of the constellation families had influenced even how the people of Earth named the stars in the skies, it wouldn't be too much of a surprise if they shared their reality in other ways. Of course, there was a lot to reconsider with this new revelation. Maybe these weren't legends of Earth or the human domain at all, but rather tidbits of the real world's history. After all, the foundation of the simulation had to come from somewhere. Lionel immediately claimed the city for himself, taking out 2 other broken territories. He commanded the stingrays to ready themselves and triggered his 3rd air-grade challenge. He felt his mind wandering as the waters began to froth. It was difficult to remain focused, and he even found himself biting his tongue again in an attempt to shift his mind away from other things. His speed of thought used to be a great asset to him, but it had suddenly become a curse. By the time he caught himself in a loop, he would have already gone through enough thinking that anyone would have taken hours, maybe even days to complete. Lionel almost didn't notice an enormous tentacle swinging down at him with a maddening momentum. It moved so fast that an air pocket formed in the depths of the sea. It was entirely unmoved by the insane water pressure, and pushed apart the water as though it was playing on the surface. This chapter upload first at USB. C0 min those last moments. Lionel's dream counter activated and his body shifted, replacing itself with a clone. Bang! The bottom of the ocean shook and quaked as Lionel snapped awake. He couldn't remember the last time his dream counter activated. It had to be remembered that his dream counter only triggered when he was on the verge of death. He had actually been that distracted just now. Lionel, despite his strength, was still ultimately at the 6th dimension. He couldn't be casual when facing off against 7th-dimensional existence, especially not ones at the air grade. A casual mistake on his part could result in true death. Suddenly he felt angry. Piss off. It was said that sound traveled far further and better in the water. Lionel hadn't thought much about it when he had lashed out, but the sudden boom of his voice sent out waves of destruction in all directions, shattering the body of the colossal squid general before into countless bloody chunks. I think you should take a look at Lionel took a breath and looked down at his chest. It was heaving irregularly, something that hadn't happened since his body had mutated after absorbing the Silver Empire's inheritance. Me? A panic attack? There was no way Lionel was tired. He had already become used to settling his fatigue with a single deep breath, but right now his heart was beating so fast it seemed to want to rip a path out of his chest. He clenched his teeth and activated Dream Sense, dispersing the feeling throughout his millions of split minds until his heart finally seemed to calm. The more he thought about it, the more annoyed he became, his eyes flaring with a flickering flame. Fuck! Lionel balled a fist, a spear of Scarlet Star Force appearing in his hand. His arm cocked back and his hips twisted, his torso flexed, and he erupted with a violent throw. The sea began to boil and the waves churned with a red aura. Lionel formed spear after spear, even using his ability index to rewire his muscle memory, throwing with both his left and right hand as though throwing with just one wasn't causing enough death and destruction for him. Very few were paying attention to Lionel at this point. He had just gotten out of a huge battle, and he seemed to have been about to settle into another dull rhythm of claiming and conquering another territory. There were simply more interesting things to watch. However, given how popular Lionel was becoming, how could there be no one who was watching him at all? Especially since he was about to conquer 3 seas, an entire 75% of the ocean? But in an irony of ironies, none of these people could tell what Lionel was going through at the moment. To them, the lights were flashy, the power was amazing, the show was grand. They were distracted by the beauty and entertained by the carnage. They couldn't feel Lionel's fury or rage. All they could see was a powerful expert displaying a might that should have been far beyond him. There was only one person who seemed to see this and understand. In an unknown location, Eleanor was, of course, watching her child. Since the entire human domain was watching, how could she not? She wouldn't miss such a thing for the world. And who could know her son better than herself? They might not have spent very much time together, but there wasn't a single part of Lionel's life that she wasn't aware of. Seeing him so infuriated at the moment left her heartbroken. The last time Lionel had entered such a state, it was after he had said those cruel words to Anna, and now he seemed to have entered such a state again. Chapter 2041. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 2041. Abhorred if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 2041. Abhorred. How could Lionel not feel the way he did? When he first entered the dimensional verse, he absolutely abhorred killing. He felt that every life was worth the same. He had always thought himself to be a logical person, and because he couldn't deduce the value of a life, he felt that he had no right to dictate the life and death of others. There wasn't any objective measure of a person's life. This had always been his reality. The first time he entered a zone, he felt so guilt-stricken by what he had done that he almost allowed someone to take his life. No, it wasn't almost. He had already given up at that point. He had already turned 18 by then, and what he thought were his final thoughts were toward his father, telling him to not mind his death because he had already succeeded as a parent, raising him to be an adult. After he left the zone, he practically had a mental breakdown after witnessing Anna's sheer disregard for the life that he held so sacred. Up until that point, the only person other than his father that he truly loved was her. To him, even though they had never been in a relationship, and even if she never accepted him, she was his family. Maybe even until now, Anna wasn't aware of just how cruel that moment had been. She wanted to wake him up to the reality of the world, to allow him to realize in a single stroke that she wasn't the idealized woman in his mind, and that the world they were in now was far crueler than he had ever known. But back then, he had just allowed himself to die at the hands of another. He had been in an incredibly fragile state. That sort of shock wasn't something that he should have been able to handle. This chapter upload first at Innovel USB. C0 man. Quite frankly, he didn't handle it very well. Not long after that, he forgot his own morals to rage. He met a great invalid, and beat it to death with the metal rod of his bicycle, completely forgetting his humanity in that moment. It might have been an invalid, but who was to say that an invalid's life was any less valuable? Wasn't he someone who couldn't objectively tell the value of a person's life? Now he was so mercilessly beating something to death just to vent his fury. Then there was the Joan zone after that, and he seemed to begin to justify his murders by the fact that the people in these zones weren't real. It was fine to kill them. They weren't living, breathing people anyway. They were just constructs, echoes of a past that had already been lived. This seemed to open the path toward Lionel's acceptance of the situation, and now he didn't even think much of his kills, although he always kept count at the back of his mind. He would be lying if he said that he was affected the same now as he had been in the past. But what now? Now he was finding out that his life was no different from the people in those zones, maybe no different from an invalid's. That sounded like an exaggeration, but to the people who had created this world, formed everything that he had come to know, was he really that different from an invalid to them? Was there really no objective measurement of a life if people could create a world like this? I think you should take a look at was there really no objective measure of a life even if this simulation didn't exist? No matter what sort of secret of the universe you chose to prescribe to, whether it was religion, whether it was science, whether it was the new world order than Lionel had just been enlightened with, in which of those cases had life not been formed by the hands of another, whether that was nature or a sentient being? What was his life worth then? There had to be an answer, and he felt that the only conclusion was that it was worth very little, an insignificant amount. A total so infinitesimally small compared to the grand scheme of reality, that it would be laughable to even care to bring it up. This answer that he had been chasing all of his life was actually meaningless. It was the foundation upon which he built everything. his want to be a king, to unite the human domain, to help them face off against the aggression of the other races. It was everything. He had spent most of his life aimless, smiling and chuckling, without a goal and without a care. He hadn't known what he was missing, the kind of life he was living if he wasn't without purpose and without meaning, until he actually gained himself such a meaning. And now that he was watching it crumble before his eyes, he was so infuriated that he couldn't even properly put it into words. So enraged that he simply wanted to destroy everything in his path. Lionel rampaged at the bottom of the ocean to the point that even the surface began to bubble. His eyes turned a striking red and chains within his consciousness seemed to vibrate wildly, on the verge of collapsing entirely. A fiery pair of wings appeared to his back, his suffocating momentum causing the air-grade generals around to cower. Their skin began to burn and char even beneath the ocean waters. Lionel seemed to entirely forget that he would have been better off using his water force. And then, there was suddenly nothing left. Lionel ran to the end of the line, but there were no more beasts, no further waves, no other air-grade generals to vent his frustration upon. There was nothing but emptiness. Lionel roared, a vortex forming at his mouth as he lifted his head, the spinning black hole of dark waters extending so far that even a whirlpool formed at the surface. The violent heat at both sides of his hips, coming from his kidneys, threatened to bore a hole through his skin, but he didn't seem to notice in the slightest. But just when it seemed that Lionel was about to lose all sense of rationality, he felt something suddenly bury itself into his chest and wrap around his waist. Chapter 2042. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 2042. Okay, no problem. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Andis novel. Com 2042. Okay, no problem. Lionel came to an abrupt stop. He could finally seem to hear around him, and the sound of his heartbeat was so loud that it rumbled like thunder. Every pulse sent waves through the waters, causing it to shudder and wince. It beat so loud that Lionel felt that a single thump could have shattered his previous set of bones before he had been eaten by the cobra demon. Lionel hadn't truly been aware of how powerful this new heart of his was until now. But it was exactly because such a heart was beating so wildly and strongly that it was so concerning. If not for the fact that it was so strong, it would have given out long ago. Now, there was nothing but a searing hotness in his chest. It felt like hot coals were resting within his ribcage and billowing scalding smoke up his throat. The pain was unbearable, and the heat of the waters around was almost as well. Looking around, Lionel realized that even the stingray beasts in the surroundings were forced to retreat a long way from him in order to avoid being crushed by their master's might. If not for this, Lionel might have wiped out 3 days of hard work all on his own. Finally, Lionel looked down to find that it was Aina. She didn't say anything and simply held on to him tight, refusing to let go. A large portion of her clothing had been burnt away, and if it wasn't for her tightly holding on to him, she may have very well shown the world far too much. Lionel took a breath, and then another, and another. Only then did the searing pain in his chest seem to finally begin to calm down. The fact it only took 3 breaths was a testament to the strength of his recovery abilities, but even so, the dull pain continued to linger, and would probably take several hours to vanish entirely. He had really pushed his body to its limits just now. If he had been any less cautious, he might have truly overheated himself and died again. It was also unknown if his soul could even survive the rampaging of his Scarlet Star Force. He really might have burned himself to death. Lionel looked around at his body to find that it was truly in a mess. His left arm was half missing, his right leg was chopped at the knee, his body was caked and covered in blood. He had truly fought like a fool. He hadn't even used his divine armors. But honestly, if he had taken out his divine armors just now, aside from maybe his 3rd tier one, the 1st and 2nd tiers would have both been destroyed under his own power, and he would have had to drain his stamina even further just to upkeep them. Lionel could only shake his head. How pathetic. Instant recovery. Lionel's hair gently waved, and a large pillar of light force and star force fell upon both himself and Aina. Not long later, though he was pretty much naked, He was in perfect condition. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0MHE wrapped his arms around Aina and ran his fingers through the back of her hair. He felt more at peace now, the slowly calming waves of the water slowing his beating heart further. Are you okay? Aina asked. She didn't know why she had rushed over here. She had a lot of work to do elsewhere, but there had been a suffocating feeling in her chest she couldn't ignore until she ran all the way over here. When she saw the state of Lionel, she knew that something was wrong. Originally, she had thought that maybe the pressure was getting to him, or maybe it was because his Scarlet Star Force innate node was taking over well ahead of the time that Wise Star Order had stipulated. However, now that she was here, she felt that it was something entirely different. Lionel didn't answer immediately, and it seemed like he wouldn't. Until he suddenly did. I don't really feel like participating in these air wars anymore, Lionel suddenly said. Aina was shocked by these words. They seemed simple, but the weight behind them was extraordinary. This was Lionel's dream. Everything he had been working toward in the last several years, everything he had done since exiting Valiant Heart Mountain, up until this point, was all for these stretch of days. And now, he suddenly didn't want to participate anymore? Even on his way here, Lionel was only acting out of habit. It all felt quite meaningless. If he hadn't been trying to stop his mind from wandering, he probably wouldn't have even triggered this upgrade challenge at all. Aina didn't know what to say for a long while. All she knew was that she couldn't allow Lionel to quit, but she didn't even know what was wrong, so she didn't know how to convince him to continue. I think you should take a look at. He didn't believe that it was the weight of the situation. Lionel was the kind of person who thrived under pressure. She knew him well enough to know that. What was the last thing he had given up on? Was it herself? And why had he done that? It was purely logical. She had crossed a line that he had drawn quite early on, and he wasn't willing to forgive it at the time. Then there must be a logical reason for this as well. Thinking back, the entire purpose for this was his want to become a king. And he wanted to become a king to help the most people possible. And he wanted to help the most people possible because he couldn't logically deduce a worth to a person's life. That meant one of two things. Either he felt that he had found an objective metric, or he had deduced that the answer was insignificant enough to be ignored. Regardless of which one it was, there was no simple answer to change his mind. Lionel was smarter and thought faster than anyone in existence, or at least, anyone that she had ever met. The only person who could draw a conclusion different from his own that he would actually listen to was his father. And he obviously wasn't here now. And knowing that man, there was no telling what he might say. In that case, trying to convince Lionel that he was wrong was something beyond her. Her gaze flickered for a moment, and after some hesitation she spoke. Do you still love me? Lionel's gaze sharpened as he suddenly looked down. What are you talking about? Of course I love you. He didn't even bother to add the still part. To him it was an unnecessary addition. His love for Aina was constant, it would never change. Aina smiled sweetly. I want our babies to be little princes and princesses. Can you do that for me? Lionel blinked. They will be already. Not of Earth, or even just of the Morales family. I want them to be able to go anywhere and still have people look up to them. To be able to go anywhere and not have to fear or hesitate about anything. Can you do that for me? Aina looked into Lionel's eyes, her golden irises dancing with a reflective light. Lionel paused for a moment, but then nodded. Okay, no problem. He spoke these words as though it was a matter of fact. So long as he cared enough to participate, wasn't the end result guaranteed? Chapter 2043. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 2043. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2043. Aina smiled sweetly, standing up to the tips of her toes and kissing Lionel deeply. Lionel seemed to feel his heart calm. The feeling of Aina's soft waist in his arm, and her ample bosom pressed against his chest was like the sweetest taste of heaven. It was so simple, and yet so relaxing at the same time. He didn't know how long he kissed her for. He seemed to have completely lost track of time, Or maybe time simply didn't matter much to him any longer. If it wasn't for the fact he knew others could start watching them at any time, he would have most definitely taken his wife to bed now. Although he thought about forcefully using his dream force to shroud such a connection, he decided against it in the end. He simply held Aina, feeling more and more at peace with every passing moment. His lips even curled into a smile as he pulled away, running his fingers through her hair. Seeing Lionel like this, Aina felt a warmth within her. No matter how hard she tried to run from it, the matters of all those years ago still haunted her. Sometimes she wondered when the next time Lionel would cruelly cut her off again without a word of care. Although she knew that she had a role to play in the matters of the past, this was still a very much human reaction on her path. However, there was no greater sign of love than what Lionel had done just now. Maybe he knew that she had only said such things to get him to continue fighting on, but just the fact she had said it was enough for him to continue. For someone like Lionel to say that he didn't care about the air wars anymore took a great deal. Whatever had happened was most definitely not just a small matter. And yet, for him to take back those words almost instantly just because of a request on her part just went to show how much weight she held in his heart. Even without saying as much, just this gesture alone assured Aina, there was never anything much to worry about in the first place. This was her man, her future husband, the person she would grow old with. This chapter upload first at USB. C0 Maina put on a new set of clothing to cover herself up while in Lionel's embrace, and then took his hand, entering the Atlantis territory along with him. She brought Lionel to the city core under his questioning gaze, and then she waved a hand. When she did so, Lionel was suddenly enlightened. In truth, he had acted without regard earlier. He had triggered the upgrade challenge without any upgrade rewards or territory rewards. So technically he had faced off against 3 air grade challenges, and 2 each of bronze grade, silver grade and gold grade. That said, a bronze grade and silver grade and gold grade challenges weren't worth much of anything in the face of an air grade challenge, especially not one that was 3 times as difficult, so Lionel hadn't cared much. Now, Aina had come with the territory upgrade reward that he would need to claim the entire sea. Like this, he had claimed his 3rd sea, and he exhaled a breath. "Do you want me to come with you?" Aina asked. The previous Lionel was on track to maximize efficiency, so when it was convenient he had sent Aina off on her own missions. However, she wanted to know if Lionel preferred her here now. "I think you should take a look at." She knew that whatever Lionel was going through wasn't just magically cured with her words. She was just happy that he cared enough about her to be able to ignore it for the time being, but that didn't mean that she didn't want to find a solution as quickly as possible. Lionel didn't respond immediately, looking out into empty space for a moment. "What do you think about life, Aina?" Aina was a bit confused, not sure where this question was coming from. In reality, no one could have known what was going on in Lionel's mind, even her. To have deduced what he had from such small and minor bits of information was absolutely ridiculous. Maybe even those in the background, pulling on their puppet strings, would have never guessed such a thing. If you didn't have the drive to gain revenge for your mother and make up for the loss of your childhood with children of your own, what do you think you'd be doing with your life right now? Andis novel. Calm Aina paused, uncertain of how to answer. Lionel's question wasn't only difficult to answer, it was nigh impossible. Removing such things from her was like creating an entirely new person. If she never experienced such things, how could she still be the same Aina? In that life, she might not have even ever met Lionel in the first place. Lionel was asking her who she would be if she wasn't herself, and even deeper than that, he was asking what her fundamental being was. However, even that seemingly fundamental question was layered with yet another even deeper meaning. What made a person? Was it their life experiences? Or was the person they would be decided upon at birth? If there was a fundamental Aina, then that would assume that everyone had an innate nature to them. If there wasn't, then that would mean that it was entirely a matter of nurture. Someone else might have tried to casually answer this question, but although she didn't seem to be as smart as Lionel, Aina held her own sort of weight in this regard. So, quite truthfully, she didn't know how to answer for a very long time. Aina had once lost her personality. Back then, was she still Aina? She still had all of her memories, so why had she acted so differently than usual? The answer was complex. Aina felt what made a person wasn't just a series of events, but also the variables associated with them. The timing, the sequence, these two things were highly important. Aina took a breath. I don't know. You're tuning in to the Lee May's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.